few years ago, something very weird happened with my best friend and I. I was 15 years old. One night I decided to sleep over at my friend's house. After a night of scary movies, we were in the mood to do something exciting. Not far from my friend's house was a demolishing site, a block of houses in a very terrible state that would be demolished the day after tomorrow. The local government would demolish them to make room for new houses. The whole site was fenced in and warning signs saying "Do not enter" hung everywhere. The houses were boarded up by planks. Doors and windows were sealed shut. No one could get in. We decided to go for a walk on the old block and take some random photographs. My friend knew a spot where we could enter the old block. When we walked there, we noticed that every house was boarded up tight, so we couldn't get in. We noticed a house with a window on the top floor that wasn't very well boarded up. We could see into the room. We took a photo with a digital camera. Later we went home and took a look at the pictures we made. Suddenly, we came across the photo of the window. We saw a woman dressed in a brown raincoat with white skin and black hair as long as we could visibly see. The woman looked very sad. We hadn't seen any woman up there when we took the picture. Moreover, the windows and doors were boarded. We went back to the house to see if that was correct. After investigation, it really was. Everything was tied shut, and there was no woman. This story isn't mine, but rather of my friend from Japan. I'll call him Rita. It happened back when Rita was only about 11 or 12 years old. Rita was a rather attractive kid and had his fair share of admirers. One girl was extreme with her crush though. I'll call her Ayano. Ayano was a lot older than Rita. She was 17. She was an acquaintance of Rita and lived down the road from him. Rita hadn't thought much of her until she started stalking him. Every day and every night, she would be following him one way or another, whether it be in person or online. Rita first started getting the creeps when she would start messaging him over 20 times a day. Stuff like, "Be safe," "Are you alright?" "Sleep well," etc. This was a little weird, but he overlooked it. Then the messages started getting creepier. Instead of the usual checkup emails, they got more personal. Things like, "You should eat your lunch," if he skipped lunch, or "I think your sister is hungry," when his little sister was crying. Rita stopped using both his phone and social media at this point, but it doesn't end there. Rita's mother was almost never home, so he was frequently looked after by babysitters. One day he had a new babysitter. It was Ayano. Nothing was particularly strange as she looked after him and his siblings, but she did get a lot closer to his mother than he would like. One day at school, Ayano approached Rita and told him that his mother would be out of the country for a week, and that she told her to let Rita stay at her house. Rita was hesitant at first, but hey, it was his mother's wish. He couldn't go against that. Ayano told him that his mother had already left, so he could go home with her after school that day. Rita reluctantly agreed and went home with her. When he got there, her parents weren't home. Things get a little blurry here as my friend choked up telling the story, as it still scares him today. He said Ayano would play weird games with him, stuff like Family, where she insisted she was the wife and he was the husband, as well as things like Cops and Robbers, and games to see who would get scared first, where she would blindfold him and leave him in a silent room for hours on end. It was 5 days into staying at her house, and Ayano had gone to her part-time job. She had left the doors locked and the windows were too high to jump from, so he just stayed in front of the TV, where he saw a chilling news report. It was a missing child report, the missing child being him. Before he had the time to catch the number to call, the TV switched off, and Ayano was standing behind him with the remote in her hand. Rita had freaked out, crying and screaming. Ayano held him, but he managed to wiggle from her grasp just in time to open a window and cry for help. Luckily for him, a couple were walking past, heard his cries and called the police. Within an hour, Police arrived and found him locked in her bedroom with a blindfold and his hands tied. Due to Ayano still being a minor, Rita is unsure of what happened to her. He says he only remembers the police taking her away while his mother was hugging him. He moved to Australia after this and hasn't seen his kidnapper since, but he still cowers at the sound of her name. About 5 years ago, I lived downtown in a major city in the US. I've always been a night person, so I would often find myself bored after my roommate, who was decidedly not a night person, went to sleep. To pass the time, I used to go for long walks and spend the time thinking. I spent 4 years like that, walking alone at night, and never once had a reason to feel afraid. I always used to joke with my roommates that even the drug dealers in the city were polite. But all that changed in just a few minutes of one evening. It was a Wednesday, somewhere between 1 and 2 in the morning, and I was walking near a police-patrolled park quite a ways from my apartment. It was a quiet night, even for a weeknight, with very little traffic and almost no one on foot. The park, as it was most nights, was completely empty. I went down a short side street in order to loop back down my apartment when I first noticed him. At the far end of the street, on my side, was the silhouette of a man dancing. It was a strange dance, similar to a waltz, but he finished each box with an odd forward stride. I guess you could say he was dance walking, headed straight for me. Deciding he was probably drunk, I stepped as close as I could to the road to give him the majority of the sidewalk to pass me. The closer he got, the more I realized how gracefully he was moving. He was very tall and lanky and wearing an old suit. He danced closer still until I could make out his face. His eyes were open wide and wild, head tilted back slightly, looking off at the sky. His mouth was formed in a painfully wide cartoon of a smile. Between the eyes and the smile, I decided to cross the street before he danced any closer. I took my eyes off of him to cross the empty street. As I reached the other side, I glanced back, and then stopped dead in my tracks. He had stopped dancing and was standing with one foot in the street, perfectly parallel to me. He was facing me, but still looking skyward, smile still wide on his lips. I was completely and utterly unnerved by this. I started walking again, but kept my eyes on the man. He didn't move. Once I had put about half a block between us, I turned away from him for a moment to watch the sidewalk in front of me. The street and sidewalk ahead of me were completely empty. Still unnerved, I looked back to where he had been standing to find him gone. For the briefest of moments I felt relieved, until I noticed him. He had crossed the street and was now slightly crouched down. I couldn't tell for sure due to the distance and the shadows, but I was certain he was facing me. I had looked away from him for no more than 10 seconds, so it was clear that he had moved fast. I was so shocked and I stood there for some time, staring at him, and then he started moving toward me again. He took giant, exaggerated tiptoed steps, as if he were a cartoon character sneaking up on someone, except he was moving very, very quickly. I'd like to say at this point that I ran away or pulled out my pepper spray or cell phone or anything at all, but I didn't. I just stood there, completely frozen, as the smiling man crept toward me. And then he stopped again, about a car length away from me, still smiling his smile, still looking to the sky. When I finally found my voice, I blurted out the first thing that came to mind. What I meant to ask was, "What the fuck do you want?" in an angry, commanding tone. What came out was a whimper. What the fuck? Regardless of whether or not humans can smell fear, they can certainly hear it. I heard it in my own voice, and that only made me more afraid. But he didn't react to it at all. He just stood there, smiling. And then, after what felt like forever, he turned around, very slowly, and started dance-walking away. Just like that. Not wanting to turn my back to him again, I just watched him go, until he was far enough away to almost be out of sight. and then I realized something. He wasn't moving away anymore, nor was he dancing. I watched in horror as the distant shape of him got bigger and bigger. He was coming back my way. He was coming back my way, and this time he was running. I ran too. I ran until I was off the side road and back onto a better lit road with sparse traffic. Looking behind me then, he was nowhere to be found. The rest of my way home, I kept glancing over my shoulder, always expecting to see his stupid smile, but he was never there. I lived in that city for 6 months after that, and I never went out for another walk. There was something about his face that always haunted me. He didn't look drunk. He didn't look high. He looked completely and utterly insane. And that's a very, very scary thing to see. In the mid-80s, my mom was a cleaner in Australia. She would clean houses in suburban areas and would sometimes do houses in rural or wine regions. She would leave business cards at the local shops and got most of her business this way, and some through referrals and word of mouth. One day she got a call from a lady who sounded like she was around 60, asking Mom to clean her old farmhouse. She made a lot of odd demands, and Mom would usually meet clients before taking on new business. In this case, the lady did not want to meet my mom and said she would leave the keys under the front doormat. Mom agreed, mainly because the lady was quite obviously wealthy and was offering to pay Mom substantially more than she would reasonably expect. Mom went to the house on a Monday morning and said she already felt unnerved by the long driveway. The house was essentially in the middle of a very large and very empty property. She found the keys and started cleaning. About an hour into the clean, she hears the back door shut. Mom was told no one would be at the house, so she immediately felt unsafe. She stood frozen in the kitchen for what she said felt like 3 or 4 minutes, although she said it could have been much longer. There was no other car on the property. She wanted to leave immediately, but had 2 rooms left to do. Both were bedrooms. She said as time passed and she heard nothing else, she decided that perhaps it was nothing, or perhaps something had fallen and it wasn't the door after all. She walked up the hallway and stepped into the bedroom. All over the bed were black and white photos. As Mom got closer, she realized that the photos were all of her. Some were taken at our family home, and others were taken at other houses Mom would clean. Some through windows or over fences. She used the house phone to call the police and immediately drove to the end of the driveway. The lady ended up being investigated, but continued to claim that it was a break-in. After some time, the police stopped with their searching and we ended up moving to a new town 4 months later. I'm 22, and this incident happened 1.5 years ago. I had just moved into my first apartment and was in the process of moving in. The door that led to my apartment locks itself automatically when closed. So, I was going to the entrance of the apartment complex to get my mail while talking on the phone with my friend. I returned to the apartment and sat on the bed while opening the mail while using the phone. I dropped the phone on the floor and it landed under the bed, so I had to lie on the floor and stretch for it. I saw something that caught my eye. There was someone under my bed. My eyes widened and I choked the urge to scream. The person under my bed was lying still with his back towards me and his head to his chest, so I couldn't see his face, and he didn't see me. Trying to be rational while so many thoughts rushed through my head, I picked up the phone, said, "Sorry, I dropped my phone. I'm just gonna take a shower and call you back." The bathroom is right by my bed, so I hastily walked in, quietly locked the door, turned the shower on, jumped out my window, and called the police. They told me to wait nearby, but to go across the street and see if anybody comes out the door of the apartment complex. This was during the summer and it was still light out. I placed myself across the street, hiding behind a car while watching my open bathroom window and the entry door. I called my friend and he came over just before the police. I gave them my keys and they went inside. Only moments later, 2 cops came out holding a thin and tired-looking man. His eyes looked crazy, but he didn't try to get away. The policeman that stood beside me and comforted me while the police searched through my house told me that the man stood outside my bathroom door with one of my kitchen knives, waiting for me to come out. This man had somehow crept in my entry door while I was getting my mail and hid under the bed. The man that was trying to hurt me turned out to be a homeless person and was placed in a mental hospital. When I was 21, me and my girlfriend were upstate in my family's vacation mobile home. It was during a snowstorm and we were sitting on the couch next to the heater, snuggling and watching late night TV. We were surrounded by absolutely nothing but forest in all directions, and all that was keeping us from the outside was a wooden door that had a broken lock. The last time my grandparents came up, my grandpa put a few cinder blocks by the door to use as a kind of barrier in the meantime, since the door opened inwards. Anyway, while we were watching TV, my girlfriend started shaking me, telling me she heard something outside. I assured her it was most likely a deer or a bear or something, but then 5 minutes later, my girlfriend looked at me again. I heard it too. I muted the TV so we could hear it better. It sounded like someone was messing around in the little lawnmower shed outside. My car was parked outside and all the lights were on inside. If there was anybody out there, they knew we were inside. My girlfriend was urging me to go outside and check it out, but I told her she must be crazy to think that I was going out there. The sound stopped and there was nothing but the sound of the storm outside now. After a few minutes, I felt it safe to shut the inside lights and open the blinds to take a quick look outside, but it was too dark to see anything. I turned on the porch light and I was able to see a good portion of the front yard outside. There were footprints in the snow. Not animal footprints. They were clearly shoe prints, and they were headed in the direction of the backyard. I went to open the curtains to the backyard window, and when I did, I felt the urge to scream, but my girlfriend did instead. Even though there were no lights in the backyard, we could see a man dressed in all black and wearing a vendetta mask facing the window. I immediately shut the blinds and told my girlfriend to go hide in the bedroom, while I grabbed my grandpa's hunting rifle out of the closet. I pushed the cinder blocks and a bunch of other heavy objects in front of the door as a barricade, shut all the blinds and lights, and went to hide with my girlfriend in the corner of the bedroom. There was a bang at the front door. He was trying to bust open the door. I don't even think he tried the knob, but it didn't matter either way. After a few futile bangs to the door, it seems the man finally gave up. I stayed up that whole night with the gun by my side while my girlfriend slept. We packed and left first thing in the morning, but the scary thing, there was a fresh set of footprints leading from the front yard window out into the woods. I haven't been up there since, but my grandparents have, and they said that there was no sign of a break-in or anything missing. I don't plan on ever going back up there. Back when my grandma was still alive, I would always walk down the block to her house every day to help with various chores. There was this one day that I walked over to her house the same time I always did and decided to let myself in. I was surprised she left the door unlocked. She was a very paranoid old lady and normally kept everything locked. I saw her bedroom door was opened upstairs and I heard her opening and closing drawers and cabinets. I walked upstairs calling Grandma, and as I was about 5 feet from the door, she slammed her bedroom door shut. I knocked, asking if everything was alright, and at that moment my cell phone began to ring. It was my grandma's phone number. I was so confused, but I picked up the phone anyway. My grandma was on the other end, telling me not to come over that day, as she was walking over to her seniors club. I felt my heart skip a beat as she told me this. I hung up the phone before she could say anything else, remaining silent. I knew exactly what was going on. I played dumb and said, "Grandma, I'll be downstairs," and made my way to my grandma's kitchen to grab a knife and dial 911. It remained silent in the bedroom after what happened. The police arrived and burst into the bedroom, and the loud and sudden bang of a gunshot caught me off guard. When the paramedics arrived and wheeled out the intruder, I recognized the man's face. It was my grandma's next-door neighbor. Apparently, he saw that my grandmother had left the house and broke in to look for jewelry. And when the police broke into the bedroom, they found the man hiding next to the door with a large knife in hand. If I had walked into that bedroom, I would have been as good as dead. The most haunting memory of my life. Me and my wife were getting home from dinner out, and as soon as we stepped out of the car, we noticed that our front door to our house was open. I told my wife to wait outside while I ran inside and ran straight up to our bedroom, where I hid the shotgun. I loaded the gun and scanned every single room upstairs. There was no sign of anybody. I made my way down to scanning the main floor, followed by the basement. There was no sign of anybody, and there was nothing missing or moved. I called the cops, and when they arrived, I told them what happened, and they began to investigate some rooms upstairs, followed by the basement. Nothing was turned up. They made a case of asking us if we were positive that we shut the door when we left. I myself was starting to have doubts, not completely sure if I had, but my wife remained confident that we had shut the door. The police seemed sure that if somebody had broken in, they didn't stick around long, as there didn't seem to be any signs of burglary. My wife was worried sick, crying that she wasn't comfortable being in the house. I comforted her the best I could, assuring her that whoever broke in the house left in a hurry. I finally fell asleep after hours of rolling around in the bed, but my sleep was immediately cut short by the disturbing scream of my wife. I looked at her, and she was staring intently in the direction of the closet. It hit me like a bullet just then. I had forgotten to check the second closet. I looked over and saw for the briefest second a man poking his head out of the closet before closing the closet door. Within 5 seconds, I had the shotgun loaded in hand and cocked it back to let the intruder know that I was armed. I screamed for him to come out, and just like that, the closet door opened, but instead of showing submission, he made a mad dash for the front door of the house. I could have shot him, but I didn't have it in me. He was never caught. He got away with it scot-free. I think having that gun saved us from a terrible fate. About a year ago, while still living under my parents' roof, I started experiencing some weird occurrences in my house, specifically my bedroom. While I was laying awake in my bed one late night, I heard a creaking sound coming from across the bedroom. My closet door had somehow been opened. When I got up to check it, I subconsciously checked for anybody inside my closet, even though I was 26 years old. Of course there was nobody inside, so I shut the door and went back to bed. Later that same night, I would hear rumbly, rattling noises coming from up above the ceiling. It sounded like something in the air ducts. It was a very strange sound. I really had no idea what to think about it, but as soon as it stopped, I kind of forgot about it quickly and fell asleep. In the morning, I did tell my dad about sounds in the attic the previous night, but annoyingly, he didn't seem too interested, or he just didn't take me very seriously. That night, I again lay in my bed awake, reflecting on life, when yet again, the slow creak of the closet door creeping open broke the silence. This time, I felt genuinely afraid. I knew the door was completely shut. It would take somebody twisting the doorknob for it to be able to push open. This time I took an extra careful look inside the closet for anybody, even though it wasn't a big closet and there really wasn't anywhere somebody could hide. I rationalized it as being a broken doorknob or something, and that same night, I again heard the rattling sounds coming from above the ceiling. It was exactly what happened the previous night. The next morning I convinced my dad to take a look at my closet door, but he quickly determined that the door was fine. When it was closed, he pulled on it, and it showed no signs of coming off the latch. Of course, he suggested that I was simply leaving the door unlatched, but I knew I wasn't. That night, I sat up, waiting for it to happen again, and right on cue, the closet door creaked open. I waited for the sounds above the ceiling, but there was just a long silence. I turned on my lamp and looked up to the air vents in my room, and I screamed at the top of my lungs. I could distinctly see two wide-open eyes peering through the vents at me. My parents barged into my room asking if I had gone insane. I explained everything, and they looked at each other like I had completely lost it. Not surprisingly, they dismissed it as a dream or the fact that I was too tired and was seeing things. They even began to lecture me about staying up too late. But to this day, I know I hadn't imagined it. It was too real. And the closet opening routinely? I know for a fact that wasn't in my imagination. I've never been a believer in the paranormal, but I still have absolutely no other explanation for those 3 nights. I live in the Poconos with my wife and kids. There's a small lake about a quarter mile away from our backyard. I commonly take my kids down there to go swimming. Up until last week, that is. Now, I'm never letting them go down there again. I haven't told anyone about this in fear of sounding crazy. It was last Saturday. We went over to the lake and set up our chairs on the sand. It's like a little private beach in our own backyard. It's been amazing. Me and my wife sat in our beach chairs enjoying the sun while our kids were splashing around in the water. I always tell them not to go too deep. They're still young, 6 and 8. We sat there for a good 2 hours that day. Neither of us were in the mood to get wet. Eventually, my wife got tired and decided to walk back home. I agreed to stay with the kids a little while longer, as they were somehow still having so much fun playing in the sand and water. The sun was setting at this point, and I was getting tired. They were going a little too deep, so I called at them to come back closer to the shore. They couldn't hear me apparently, so I stood up and got closer. Before I could call them again, I noticed something in the water. It looked like a black, roundish object, and it was moving closer to my kids. I ran into the water closer to my kids, calling them to come out. When they got close enough, I dragged them out myself. When I turned back to the water, the object was gone. My kids were confused as hell. I didn't know what to tell them, so I just told them it was time to go home. We packed up and walked back to the house, but I wasn't happy when I got home. I was uncomfortable with what I just saw. That thing looked like no sea creature known to man. Dinner was waiting for us when we got home. I ate really slow, thinking about the object in the water and whether or not to tell my wife. My wife asked me what's wrong. She noticed that I was eating slow. I decided not to tell her right then. After dinner, I took a flashlight with me and walked back down to the lake. By then, it was already dark out. I got to the lake, but to be honest, I didn't even know what I was expecting to find. I shined the flashlight all around the surface of the water, searching for the black object, and just then, I heard a large splash come from somewhere in the lake. The kind of splash of something emerging out of the water. I thought it might be some kind of animal in the lake. I shined the light all over the place, searching for the source of the sound, and then I found it, and I realized I was dead wrong. There was a silhouette of a humanoid figure with long black hair covering its whole face. It just stood there, facing me, but not staring at me. Not that I could tell. I dropped the flashlight in horror and sprinted all the way back up to my house, slamming the door shut behind me. I haven't told anybody about this. What kills me is that lake is only a quarter mile away from my house, and for all I know, that thing could be watching me through my window right now as I write this. was approaching the end of summer, and my friends and I wanted to do some cool, mischievous things before going back to school. So, we had the genius idea one night to sneak into a nearby community pool. It was actually only a couple blocks away. It's right smack in the middle of a residential area, so instead of sitting on a main road or something, it actually just sat around a bunch of houses on a quiet road. During a hot day, the little parking lot would be full and the spot would be bustling. But at 1 in the morning, the place was of course dead. There's obviously a big fence surrounding the whole front entrance, as well as a cage that gets closed up when the place closes, so our best way was to get in through the side. We snuck into the backyard of a neighboring house and hopped the fence over to the pool. It was as easy as that. The 4 of us took off our shirts and jumped into the pool, which in retrospect wasn't smart, since any of the neighbors could have heard the splashes and just called the police. But we were dumb high schoolers. It was very, very dark within that whole enclosing. This pool had no lights, which is why it closed at sunset. James, Courtney, and Alyssa were on the other side of the pool, as I was just kind of doing my own thing at first, swimming around and getting my face wet. I saw Alyssa get out of the pool shortly after and run away. I swam over to see what was going on. She was just going to the water fountain though. The 3 of us just bopped around in the water for a bit, and eventually we heard Alyssa jump back into the pool from the other side. It was too dark to see much more than her black hair covering her face. But just then we heard Alyssa playfully call something to us as she was walking back to the pool. The 3 of us in the pool looked at each other. I know they were doing the same thing as me, counting heads. There were 3 of us on this side of the pool, and here came Alyssa walking over to our side. So who was that on the other side? Alyssa got in, but the 3 of us were distracted, looking at the head bopping around the water across the pool. James said across the pool, "Who is that?" Not even 2 seconds later, the head went underwater and disappeared from view. We took this time to whisper to each other, mostly things like, what should we do? What if that's security? And should we run? Suddenly I felt something grab my leg with force and tried pulling me down into the water. I kicked, splashed, and yelled for help. James came over to pull me out of the pool, while the girls were already running for it, screaming. It wasn't until I got to the stairs of the pool that the grip on my leg was released and I was free. We hopped the same fence we climbed over to get in and ran all the way back to Alyssa's house. I was convinced that whoever that was a security guard. That is, until they literally tried to pull me under the water. We don't know what to think. There are a few possibilities. Maybe it was just another kid messing with us, maybe it was a security guard who went way too far, or most likely, it was a dangerous person who had ill intent. It was an ordinary day like any other. 85 degrees out, family getting ready to jump in the pool. I was looking for my 6-year-old brother so I could help him into the pool, but I thought I'd just wait for him in the pool instead. My parents were still inside while I got ready to jump in the pool, but I didn't, because I saw something dark sitting at the bottom of the pool. It took me a few seconds to realize it was my little 6-year-old brother at the bottom of the pool. It took my young brain a few moments to realize he wasn't playing around. I screamed in such a loud and high pitch you would think it was a little girl if you heard it. I remember the feeling of my skin crawling as my helpless 8-year-old self didn't know what to do. My parents burst out the back door. My dad dove into the pool and grabbed my little brother from the bottom. It was nothing short of a miracle that my dad managed to resuscitate him though. Thereon after, we weren't allowed back into the pool unsupervised until we were both at least 10 years old. I remember waking up from a deep sleep and looking at the clock, seeing it was around 2 in the morning, when I heard splashes coming from my pool in the backyard. My bedroom window didn't have a view of the pool, so I had to run downstairs to the den to get a view. And let me tell you, I was freaking out on my way down there, especially given that I live alone.
The blind was shut, but the windows were open, and I could still hear a little splashing coming from the pool. I had to be quiet opening the blinds, otherwise I risked exposing myself. I lifted the blinds only enough to get a view of the pool, but the splashing stopped. I waited a few minutes before deciding it was safe to go outside. I walked up to the pool and nearly had a heart attack when I saw a body submerged underwater on the shallow end. I pulled the body out of the water, hoping it was more than just a body still, but he didn't seem to be breathing. I looked around my yard in a panic, and by an off chance caught This happened when we were staying in a small country inn. It was a family trip to some distant resort where our extended family would be meeting us. It was such a long drive, however, that we needed to stop for the night. The inn was across the street from some big fruit stand and some crops. Other than that, it was thick forest in every direction. There were a couple other cars parked in the parking lot, so we weren't the only ones. We arrived there after eating dinner at some small diner, so the day was basically over. The sun had set, but it was still early and we didn't know what to do, so we decided to hop in the pool that the inn surprisingly had. There was no one around to stop us, so as far as we knew, it was allowed. We kind of just played typical pool games that we played ever since we were little kids, like Shark. We thought it being dark made it more fun, even though it was kind of creepy being surrounded by nothing but forest for miles. For whatever reason, I was peering over to the woods. There was a guy just standing by a couple trees. He didn't appear to be attempting to hide or anything. It was blatantly obvious he was glaring over to us. I did a little side head nod to my brother to let him know what I saw. He looked over and said, "Jesus Christ, that's creepy." The man then walked over to the poolside and took a seat on one of the lounge chairs. He just looked at us and said, "Wonderful night for a swim, huh?" And then a pretty off-putting chuckle. My brother and I did our little fake polite laughs and said yeah. Meanwhile, all that we were thinking was, alright, it's time to get out of the pool. But I guess we didn't want to make it obvious that we were leaving because of him. It was so painfully uncomfortable that my brother and I didn't even speak to each other. Then the man got up, still watching us, and walked over literally to the edge of the pool and just stood there looking down at us. Eventually I asked if he worked with the hotel, and he completely ignored my question. That's when things got really uncomfortable. I whispered to my brother we should go. As soon as we started moving towards the ladder, the man started walking fast over to the ladder, so we stopped and stayed in the pool. We played it off like nothing about it was weird, but my heart was racing, and I knew my brother's was too. The pool had stairs on one side as well, but as we tried to make our way over to them, the man seemed to inch his way to the stairs too. We were trapped in there, not knowing what he was planning, but by some stroke of luck, our dad appeared from behind the corner of the building, calling us to come out of the pool. We both screamed help and accused the man of trying to hurt us. Our dad, who was much taller than the man, sized him up, pushed him, yelled at him, and threatened to call the police. I remember the man didn't say anything in response. He just walked away slowly as my dad yelled curse words at him. His reaction to our dad alone suggested that he had intentions of doing something wrong, like God forbid kidnapping us. I'm going to share a very disturbing memory from my early years. My name is Daniel. When I was 6, maybe 7 years old, our family lived in New Jersey. Our old house was on a very quiet street. We had the same next-door neighbor living next to us for as long as I was alive. One hot day when it was just my dad home, the neighbor came over and introduced himself to me as Paul. He asked my dad if he could take me to his pool, and from what I remember, he seemed very genuine and nice. I guess that's why my dad let me go with him. I remember hopping around on the shallow end of his pool, and he swam in the deeper end, watching me the whole time, smiling. He asked me questions like where I go to school, what I do for fun, what shows do I like, and so on. He asked me if I knew how to swim, and I shook my head no. He swam over to me and started lifting my legs and arms, trying to show me how to swim. It didn't really work out, but he said he'd invite me over one night and keep helping me. Well, apparently one night was the next night. I heard splashes coming from the pool next door from my room as I was laying in bed. I opened the window and saw Paul looking up to my window, waving. He called up to my window to come on over with my bathing suit. Excited by the thought of it, I threw on my bathing suit and snuck out the front door. It's funny, I knew well enough that what I was doing would go against my parents, given that I knew to sneak out. That night as we were in the pool together, Paul was extra touchy as he was supposedly showing me how to swim. But at the same time, I didn't realize what was going on. Suddenly I heard the shout of my dad from my window, and less than half a minute later my dad was in Paul's backyard, yelling at him, threatening to get a restraining order if he ever came near me again. My parents had me describe what Paul did to me, and I said nothing, because that's truthfully what I believed. They told me to never speak to Paul again, and pretty soon started looking for a new house. In the meantime, however, one night out of curiosity, I sat up from my bed and looked out the window. There was Paul, standing in his pool, looking up at my window, waving me over once again, but also putting his finger on his lips, meaning to be quiet. I shut the blinds and ignored him, listening to my parents. A few nights later, around the same time, there was a knock at the window. Or at least I thought it was a knock at first. It just sounded like a loud thump. Then there was another one. I opened my window and saw Paul down below in our backyard. He spoke up to me in a soft voice, asking me to sneak down and we'll hang out inside his house. I shut the window and went straight to my parents' room and told them. My mom screamed at my dad to go break Paul's neck. My mom held me in her arms as she got on the phone with the police. Meanwhile, we both heard my dad yelling incomprehensible things outside. Paul was arrested for attempting to lure a child. I don't know much else about what happened though, because the next day, my mom and I stayed with my grandma until we moved to a new house. I never really talk about this with my parents, only because it's very uncomfortable to talk about. And it's also just a painful memory.
This experience happened many years ago. I'm 23 now, but I grew up a scout. I started with the Cub Scouts, then transitioned to the Boy Scouts, and eventually earned the accomplishment of becoming an Eagle Scout. Throughout my years as a scout, I've been on countless campouts. Many friends came and went as kids quit the Scouts throughout the years, but one friend who stuck it through the whole way with me was Justin. Me and Justin were in the same grade, and we were close friends. At the time of this experience, we were both going to be entering 10th grade, 15 years old. As weird as it sounds, I honestly don't even remember what park we were camping out at. It was just too long ago. As soon as everybody had arrived, Scoutmaster Davis led the group on our hike to the campsite. After setting up our tents and having a quick snack, Scoutmaster Davis led us on another hike as the sun was starting to set. He liked to take us on hikes in the dark, as he thought it taught good directional skills. On the way back, we had to use our flashlights since it was getting too dark. Mr. Davis played a little game to mess with the younger kids, acting like we were lost and they had to find the way back. He had one of the younger kids start to lead the way back, but the kid soon froze in his tracks and looked to Mr. Davis, claiming he heard something. Mr. Davis acted all forest rangery, stepping forward and making a listening motion. Me and Justin laughed out loud, and he shushed us.
There was another sound, a very obvious step from a larger creature in the distance. Kids were shining their flashlights all over the place. Mr. Davis assured us it's okay as long as we make a lot of noise to keep any potential predators away. I gotta admit, it was a bit scary hearing him say that. Mr. Davis led the way back from there on out, but on several occasions, either me, Justin, or some other kid would point out steps coming from behind us. Clearly something was following us. Mr. Davis told us to just stay with the group and not to refrain from making noise. We got back to the campsite where we cooked a couple turkeys, popped open a few cans of corn, and then sat around the campfire where Mr. Davis began telling his famous stories. However, it was interrupted by footsteps circling around the campfire. Scouts started turning around looking into the woods. Even the scoutmasters looked at each other. Assistant Scoutmaster Roberts hopped up, said, "Alright, this'll scare him off," and went for the gun in his tent. He pulled out his rifle and fired a shot into the air. We didn't hear any more footsteps after that. After a whole hour of listening to Mr. Davis's stories, scouts started heading to their tents. Me and Justin were in the same tent, and knowing how early the scoutmasters made us get up, we didn't really joke around for too long. The only sounds now were the crickets and the crackling of the fire outside. I fell asleep quickly, given how exhausted I was from all the hiking, but woke up to Justin nudging me. When my senses came to, I listened, and heard footsteps coming from outside the tent. The campfire was still lit outside, and it created a glow on the tent walls. But it also allowed us to see the shadow outline of what was outside. A person. I whispered, "So what, it's probably someone just going to take a piss." He told me to open the zipper and peek outside. I did what he said, and to my horror, there was some heavy-built man with a sack over his head and a ripped working shirt, very clearly holding a big knife. He was walking around some of the other tents. I zipped the opening back up and told Justin to be quiet. We had no phones or anything, so we couldn't call one of the scoutmasters. All we could do was wait. We couldn't tell if or when the man had left. We just sat there for what felt like hours, waiting, and eventually we fell asleep. We awoke to one of the scoutmasters blowing that stupid wake-up horn. Me and Justin were surprised that we even fell asleep given the situation, but we immediately went to go tell our scoutmasters what we saw. All three of them took our claims very seriously and wanted to make sure we weren't joking. They had no choice but to tell everyone to pack up and call their parents to get a ride home within 3 hours. Now this is the really weird part. Two of the younger kids in the group had their entire bags stolen, which mainly contained their clothing. When the scoutmasters went to investigate around their tents, we were all disturbed to see that there had been tiny holes carved into the tents, big enough for someone to look into. And that's exactly what the holes were for. The scoutmasters reported the incident to the town in which the park resides. It still horrifies me, given how real the situation was for me, that somebody literally followed us into the middle of the woods, spied on two 11 or 12-year-old kids while they slept, stole their clothes, and did whatever else. Thankfully, nobody was hurt, but the incident overall hurt the group, as some parents refused to allow their kids to go on any more campouts. It's sad that some sick people out there can really ruin things for a lot of other people. I'm a 15-year-old Boy Scout from Houston, Texas. My troop flew us out to Denver, Colorado, and we drove to a camp called Camp Alexander, about 45 minutes away from Colorado Springs. Me and 4 other people in our troop were participating in the high adventure program that the camp offers. This basically means that we were doing things like climbing mountains and white water rafting. 4 days into our trip and nothing has happened to us. We set up our tents next to the Arkansas River, as we would be rafting in it the next day. I sleep very poorly in sleeping bags and had been waking up covered in sweat every night, and that night was no different. I woke up with my face in a puddle of drool and sweating all over my body. I checked my watch and it was around 3:45 a.m. I decided that it would be best for me to step out of my tent for a while and cool down. I put on a shirt and shorts and unzipped my tent. The way my tent was positioned, the opening was facing towards the river, and I immediately noticed that there was someone standing in the middle of the river facing downstream. The water was about waist high and 30 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and whoever was standing in there didn't have a shirt on, so I was extremely confused. After a moment of staring, I realized that I knew this person. He was my friend, who I'll be referring to as Dalton for privacy reasons. I called out for him 2 times before he finally moved. He looked right at me, and then he looked around as if he were processing the situation. He yelled at me, "What the fuck?" He ran back to the shore as fast as he could. I grabbed him a towel and shirt and asked him what the hell he was doing in the middle of the river at 4 in the morning. He answered saying that he didn't know and that he had just woken up to me yelling at him in the middle of the river. I don't know how he got there or if he sleepwalked or something like that, but it was seriously creepy. Nobody believed us in the morning and we just decided to forget about it. Dalton said he had never sleepwalked before or anything like that, so I have no idea why or how he would have gotten into that river. All I know is if I didn't wake up that night and get out of the tents, my friend Dalton might have been dead come morning time. This is going to be a brief, horrifying 100% true story of mine. I was 13 years old and one of the quieter kids in my Boy Scout troop. I'm not totally a shy person, but I couldn't really relate to any of the kids in my Boy Scout group. We were on our last campout of the 2008 camping season. It was in October and it was a little chilly, making our many hikes a little more bearable. This was the last campout of my life, and you'll soon know why. During one of our hikes, I was trailing behind the group as I usually did. I had this sudden urge to pee, so I let the group get a little further ahead and then went behind a tree. I almost had a heart attack as something made a heavy thud on the ground not too far away from me. It didn't sound like a stick or branch falling, it sounded like something putting its foot down into the leaves. I didn't know what to think, all I know is I was freaked out. I ran to catch up to the group. I had no idea what just happened, so I didn't want to tell anybody about it. I'll skip ahead to that night when I was trying to fall asleep. I had my own tent, as did some of the other kids in our tiny little troop, so I tried to go to sleep right away. A strange noise soon interrupted the silence, however. It sounded like breathing coming from a phone or something, and it seemed to be coming from inside my bag. After digging through my bag, I pulled out a big, heavy walkie-talkie. The only thing, I didn't bring or own that. Suddenly, in a deep, almost muffled voice, someone said into the walkie-talkie,
"I'm watching you, kid."
I pressed down the talk button and said, "Who is this?" One of the other kids were clearly pranking me. There was no response, only this sudden static. "Is this Mike?" There was silence. And then,
"I'm right outside your tent."
the fabric of the tent suddenly started pushing in on me as something from outside was pushing into it. I screamed like a baby, and that's when whoever was outside ran into the woods. 2 of my scoutmasters came rushing into the tent. I could barely even breathe, but I somehow managed to show them the walkie-talkie and explain what just happened. They lectured the kids for a few minutes, thinking it was one of them messing with me, but when I calmed down, I stepped in and told them that the voice was way too deep for it to have been any of them. We were all forced to share tents with 2 others that night, and the next day we packed up and moved to a nearby campsite with another Boy Scout troop. I really don't know what they did with the walkie-talkie. I was emotionally disturbed, embarrassed, and I just wanted to go home. I convinced my parents to let me quit Boy Scouts after that incident. It was by far the scariest experience of my life.
I remember this just vaguely, since I was little at the time, maybe 7. In my old house, my room had its own floor. It wasn't even supposed to be a bedroom. It was more of an attachment to the attic, or a closet-type room. The people that owned the house before us used it as a playroom for their daughters. My room also had a huge closet door that was attached to the attic. The closet was elevated up so that you would have to climb a set of wooden stairs to get into it. It had a big sliding door, and it was completely packed with toys and other junk from my childhood. Since I was little at the time, I always got scared of being so separated from the rest of my family and having that huge closet in my room. Then there was this one night. I was laying in bed, afraid after watching a scary movie with my family. Then I heard the sound of a toy fall over up in the closet. I jumped out of my bed and ran to my parents' room. They told me there was no one in my closet. They saw how afraid I was, so they let me sleep in their room that night. The next night, I had kind of forgotten about it until I heard it again. The sound of a container of Legos spilling out everywhere up in the closet. Again, I ran to my parents' room and told them about it. My dad was starting to grow impatient with me. He reluctantly agreed to let me sleep in their room again. The next day, me and my mom checked the closet, and there it was. A pile of Legos lay on the floor, spilled out of the container. I thought this was proof that somebody was in my closet, but my mom assured me that it simply fell over. That night, my dad locked his door. He said he was tired of my nonsense. I couldn't sleep that night. I lay there completely silent with my young boy imagination running, waiting for another sound to come from the closet. It was probably about an hour before it happened. It broke the silence. The sound of the closet door rolling open with force. The moonlight shining through my window illuminated the figure standing by my closet door. I let out the most horrific, ear-piercing scream you've ever heard, as pure terror swept over my body, a feeling that I still remember today. The figure jumped down from the closet and ran out of my room and out the front door of my house. My mom ran up to my room in shock, as my dad ran downstairs trying to catch whoever it was, but he never did. The police never caught the man. When I was in 8th grade, I went on a school trip that was called the Louisiana Tour. It was mostly going around to significant sites in South Louisiana. One of the places we went to was Myrtle's Plantation, which is considered to be one of the most haunted places in the country. There are all kinds of stories about the place, but at one point we were standing in a room as a part of a larger group, and the tour guide was talking about something. I don't remember what. As I'm standing there, I start to hear what sounds like someone hitting a piano key. After I heard it a couple times, I started to look around for the source of the sound. I didn't see a piano, but I kept hearing it, so I asked my friends who were standing near me if they heard it. They said no. When I heard it again, I said there it is again, they must have heard it. They thought I was crazy. So I went back to looking around the room. Everyone's eyes were on the tour guide except for one woman. She caught my eye and pointed at me, and then at her ear with a questioning look. I realized she was asking if I heard it too, and I nodded. At this point, the tour guide starts telling a story about a soldier who had died there and that he played the piano, and multiple guests had reported hearing him playing in the night. I honestly didn't know what to think. I guess I still don't. I talked to the woman as we were all leaving the room, and she said she heard the exact same thing as me, but her husband and son had not heard it. It was near Halloween time when my friends and I were telling ghost stories. My friend said she was going to tell a story about her parents' first date. She said she didn't like telling the stories since it was actually true, but we prodded her on. To cut to the chase, the parents had a nice, if awkward, first date, and around the time that they would have said goodnight, the male in this situation, who's my friend's dad, suggested that they go for a midnight hike up Provo Canyon. He apparently knew the place, since he had done a fair amount of rock climbing in the area. So the two drove up the mouth of the canyon, got out of their cars, and started hiking under just the light of the stars, since it was a new moon. At some point, the man starts getting a bad feeling, since the pathway ahead, which would pass under some trees, would be dark, and because it was getting quite late. He ignores the feeling and presses on. A minute later, the feeling came back to the man. He ignored it again and started walking a bit of the way into the trees when his foot hit something soft in the middle of the path. Under the trees, it was too dark to see just what this soft thing was, and the feeling came back stronger than ever. Instead of finding out what his foot had bumped into, he and the woman both agreed to hightail it out of there. Years later, after being married for some time, they were watching an interview with the serial killer Ted Bundy. In response to a question asking him to describe the time that he felt the closest to being caught, he explained about the night that he lured a girl into Provo Canyon and had just killed her when he heard some people coming up the trail. He explained how he hid in the trees just in time, only to watch some guy walk right into the body, and for some reason, just turn around and walk away. My school's library is open until 2 in the morning for the idiots like me that don't do their essays until the last minute. It's a pretty small building and most of the books are in the basement area called the stacks. Just to give you a quick layout, there's the big main stairs that go down to the stacks, a vending machine room, and the long hallway with the 4 entrances into the stacks. The stacks are 2 really big rooms on opposite sides of the hallway with a huge amount of bookshelves and study desks lining the walls. I was there around 11 p.m. last year. It was a pretty research-intensive essay, so I was down in the stacks working in one of the study desks, so I didn't have to keep going upstairs and downstairs again. I had been there for maybe 2 hours, and everyone except for a boy working a few desks down from me had already left. I was pretty zoned out by this point. It was an 8 a.m. class, so I didn't have much time until it was due, and I was sort of panicking. So it really pissed me off when I heard someone flipping through book pages really fast to make them do that loud whipping noise at the other end of the room. I sort of ignored it for a while, thinking they'd go away eventually, but they just kept doing it. After about 5 minutes, I got sick of it and started to walk over to tell them to knock it off. I get about 3 steps across the room and it just stops. I sat back down and it was quiet again, only for like 10 minutes before the flipping pages noise started again, only loads louder, like they'd grabbed a huge book that time. The boy started to get pissed off too, and he stood up and started walking around through the bookshelves trying to find them. It kept going, so I got up too and started looking around with him. It got really loud and it was pretty obvious where it was coming from by that point, so we started walking towards it. He was on one side of the shelves and I was on the other. We walked all the way down the shelves. No one there. We hadn't seen anyone come in the stacks and we were on the side of the room with the entrances. No way could anyone have come in without us seeing them. The noise stopped again and we both sort of just slowly walked back to our seats. I assumed it was just a fan or something in the other room and I really needed to get my essay done. We sat down and immediately the noises started again. It sounded like it was coming from right next to the guy's chair. He shoved his stuff in his bag, looked at me, said, "Fuck this," and took off. I was out of there maybe 5 seconds behind him. I still won't go back in the stacks at night, even when there's other people down there. This happened when I still had my fishing boat. It was a horrifying experience that will never leave us. Me and my wife departed from the East Coast for our 2-day fishing trip in the North Atlantic. The first day and night were normal. We got a decent catch. At night we played cards while listening to music. It was enjoyable up until the next night. After a slow day at sea, we were playing cards again inside, this night without the music. It was at that moment that we heard the sound of a boat motor. We rushed outside to see a man piloting a crappy old motorboat with absolutely no lights on. He had stopped directly in front of our bow. The man was middle-aged. He had a beard and a baseball cap on. I went up closer and asked him if he needed help. He asked us if we had any spare gasoline. I apologized and told him we didn't. I asked the man if he was low on fuel and if he needed a ride back to the shore, but he declined. He claimed he had plenty of gas, which brought an awkward silence as me and my wife wondered why he asked us for gas then. The silence started to creep me and my wife out, mostly because of the way he just blankly stared at me. The only reason I could see was because of the deck light in the front of our boat. Other than that, we were surrounded by darkness. The man finally broke the silence and asked us if we had a good catch that day. I told him we didn't, still trying to be polite, even though the situation was odd and creepy. I asked the man how he was getting around in the darkness, but all he gave me was a chuckle, as if I had made a joke. I figured he misheard me. He turned his little motorboat around, and the last thing he said to us was, "Nice meeting you folks." He sailed off into the total blackness surrounding us. Me and my wife were completely weirded out. My wife told me she was afraid he was going to rob us. Being a fisher, you run into and make conversation with other sailors and fishers all the time, but I knew something about that guy was off. The fact that he came up to us so late at night, so far from the shore, and alone in that little motorboat, and the way he acted, we were both really uncomfortable, so I decided to turn out our lights and sail a bit north just to make sure the guy couldn't find us again. Call me paranoid. Later that night, probably around 2 in the morning, I woke up to the disturbing and ear-piercing scream of my wife. I shot up from my laying position to see a man standing at the edge of our bed. I lunged out of the bed towards the man, but he was out of the cabin before I could even get out of the room. I heard the sound of the same motorboat starting before speeding away into the darkness again. We sailed all the way back to the shore that night and reported the man right away. Of course, nothing was ever heard of the topic again. We still have no idea what the man wanted or what he was planning on doing, but it still gives me nightmares to this day. The way my bedroom was laid out was that across the room from my bed, there's a small alcove that does not receive any light because of the closet that's slightly in front of it. So the closet blocks the ceiling light and the ambient light from outside when it's dark. I was in 4th year high school and was trying to sleep but couldn't. You know that feeling like someone's staring at you? I was feeling it. I couldn't shake it, and it just felt like whatever was staring at me had such malicious intent in it. I opened my eyes and my gaze was drawn to that dark corner of the room where I saw a hazy, darker outline in it. I got goosebumps, but thought that it was nothing there. I'm just imagining things. I closed my eyes again, trying to force myself to get sleep, but I can't shake that evil feeling stare. Then, there was a creak sound, the sound from somebody putting pressure on the floor. I opened my eyes again, and that shadow thing was in the opposite corner now. All my inner senses went ballistic, and I threw my pillow and blanket over my head as I cried myself to sleep, all while hoping that the thing wouldn't come closer. I know I didn't imagine or dream it, and it still sends chills down my spine to this day. It was the first time my family ever went camping together. I was 18 at the time. We probably wouldn't have gone if it weren't for my brother and sister who were still only 11 and happened to be twins. It was mid-July and I was actually excited to do it. We drove all the way out to the country. We didn't go to a camping site. My dad just parked the car on the side of a quiet road, and we hiked about a mile into the woods until we found a small clearing in the woods. We pitched our 2 tents, one for me and my siblings and one for my parents. So come nighttime, I couldn't sleep at all. Trying to fall asleep in that sleeping bag was like trying to fall asleep on the grass. I just couldn't get to sleep. I spun around and tried to make myself comfortable for hours. My little brother and sister had been asleep for a long time at that point. And then I heard the sound of the zipper to the tent zipping down. I looked up and saw someone poking their head into the tent. I couldn't see who it was. "Dad?" I whispered. Whoever it was removed their head from the inside of the tent. "Dad?" I said louder. Whoever it was quickly moved away from the tent, leaving it unzipped. I was so confused. I was sure it was my mom or dad just checking on me, so I crawled out of the tent and walked over to my parents' tent. I unzipped it and crawled inside. My parents were both in their sleeping bags. I shook my dad until he woke up. I asked him if he had just checked on us. He said no. I got chills as he said it. I then woke up my mom, hoping that it was her, but she groggily told me that she hadn't left the tent either. I got goosebumps all over as I came to the realization that somebody actually came up to our tent, opened up the zipper, and peered inside. A stranger. For all I know, some sort of psycho. I couldn't even really tell if my parents took me seriously or not, or maybe I just don't remember. But I do remember that I didn't get a minute of sleep that night. My parents were on their honeymoon to Key West. When they arrived at the hotel to check in, they were told that the room would be non-smoking. With my dad being a smoker, they requested a different room. They got the room switch and went to their room. As they got off the elevator, the smell of fresh paint was overwhelming. Down the hall there was a painter with all necessary supplies laid out around him as he was painting the wall. As my parents walked past him, they casually greeted him, and the painter had absolutely no acknowledgement of their presence. Whatever. When they got to their room, the smell of paint was even worse in there, so bad it wasn't even bearable, so they decided to go to the front desk to change rooms. When they explained the situation, the attendant looked very confused and informed them that there wasn't a scheduled paint job on that floor for that day, but agreed to change their room anyway. My parents go back to their floor to grab their luggage, and the painter is completely gone. All supplies cleaned up and gone within 10 minutes, and the smell of paint was completely gone. At this point, my parents were freaked out, but didn't think much of it and went to their new room. The next morning on their way to breakfast, they overhear a tour guide talking to a group. My parents tuned in when the guide mentioned the floor that they were originally supposed to stay on. Apparently a long time ago, there was a painter on that floor painting and fell down the elevator shaft to his death. Now my parents don't normally believe in the paranormal, but after an event like this that they had no explanation for, it freaked them out a good bit. This story didn't happen to me, it happened to my cousin, and yet it still freaks me out thinking about it. This story is all too true. My cousin Nikki was on Skype with his girlfriend Sam at around 1 in the morning on a Friday night. She was asking him to come over and stay the night, but he didn't really want to drive over that late. Sometime into the conversation, Nikki noticed the closet door behind Sam open a crack. Nikki pointed it out, and Sammy turned and looked at the closet. They both ended up ignoring it. It was probably another half hour into the conversation that the closet door creaked open even more. Nikki spotted it again and told Sam that her little brother must be hiding in the closet. She denied it and told him the window was open or something, so there must have been a draft. It was about half an hour later that the closet door completely opened and somebody stepped out of the closet and walked out of Sam's bedroom. Sam didn't seem to notice, but Nikki got startled from what he just saw. He told her that her little brother was hiding in her closet, but what she said next scared Nikki shitless. She told him that she was home alone that night. Nikki started yelling at the screen for her to lock her door and call the police, and that he would be over there as fast as he could. Sam just started to understand the situation as she turned and saw the closet door completely open. She ran over to her doorway and let out a blood-curdling scream before slamming the door shut and locking it. Nikki drove over as fast as he could while calling the police. When he got there, the front door was left open, so he ran into the house into Sam's room. He knocked on the door and told her it was him, but she wouldn't answer. When the police finally arrived, they busted open the door to find her curled up in the corner of the room in shock. She later told the police that she had seen somebody standing face to face with her at the doorway before shutting the door. It was a dark and stormy night, the kind of stormy that I loved, thunder and lightning roaring, so I was staying up late watching movies. I lived with my dad, but he wasn't home that night. He was working nights. Anyway, after I finished watching the movie Forrest Gump for the 100th time, I decided 2 a.m. was a good time to get some shut-eye. I loved going to sleep during thunderstorms. It was just enjoyable to listen to, but suddenly, I heard the sound of something hitting my window. It wasn't the sound of rain hitting the window, but in such a big storm I didn't think much of it and put my head back down. But a few seconds later, the same noise. Something hits the window again. This time I made the sound out to be a rock hitting the window. My heart started racing. It couldn't be my dad. He would call if something was wrong. Another rock hits the window. I found myself glued to my bed. I didn't want to look out the window, but whoever was outside surely knew I was up there. I had just turned the TV off. They could have seen the bright glare through the window. I just decided if I ignored it, they would go away. Another rock hit the window, and then another. It was getting faster. The rain started to lighten up, and that's when I heard the sound of a truck engine running down in the street. A much louder thump to the window was where I drew the line. I got out of my bed planning to call the cops. I ran down the stairs towards the phone, but as I passed the front door, I saw something. Something through the glass window at the top of the door. It was the face of a person looking through to me. It seemed like they had a smile on their face. I sprinted to the kitchen and called the police. They said there was an officer nearby, and they should be there shortly. Whoever was at the door started fiddling with the doorknob and eventually ramming into it, trying to bust it open. I grabbed a knife for protection and yelled that the police were coming, before running back upstairs to my room. After about a minute, the ramming to the door stopped and there were no more rocks hitting my window. I still didn't dare to look out the window, but I remember hearing the sound of the truck drive off. A few minutes later, I heard the sound of a police siren outside, and moments later, the doorbell rang. I explained everything to the officer. I described the face as best as I could. Unfortunately, I couldn't provide him any information about the vehicle. If only I had looked out the window. I still regret not taking a quick look. There was never enough info for the police to catch these people. Not sure if they had intention of robbing my house, or much worse.
My name is Aiden. I live in rural Vermont with my parents and two brothers. One weekend, when my parents were gone, my grandma had us take a little trip over to her house for the weekend. She has money, so she lives on a nice big private property, and she has things for us to do there. It was the closest thing to a vacation that we'd get all summer. I'm the oldest, and I was 15 at the time, so I guess my parents still didn't fully trust us to be left home alone at that time. Me and my younger brother were playing basketball out front until the sun was just starting to set. After that, we went inside and ate dinner. My grandma later called me down from my room because we left the door to the Morton building open. That confused me because we didn't even go into the Morton building. I went downstairs to the dining room window where I could see that the door was in fact open. It was dark out there now, but the light above the door was on and made it easy to see the opening. I called up to my two brothers, who both claimed they didn't open it. I expressed concern to my grandma, suggesting maybe somebody had broken in. She overreacted, as she does with everything. I went to the front door and looked out the glass up top, and literally screamed, "Holy shit." My grandma yelled, "What's wrong?" and started freaking out. I told her I saw a man just standing at the bottom step of the front porch. She came over to look for herself, and then started yelling to call the cops. I told her I'm gonna go outside and confront him, but she literally would not let me. She would cry and beg me not to open the door, and even tugged at my arm each time I tried to grab the doorknob. I finally agreed to call the cops instead and waited out. My grandma got on the phone, almost crying to the operator, kind of overreacting by stating that somebody is gonna break into our house. I sat in the dining room looking out the window, watching the man. My grandma wouldn't allow my two younger brothers to even come downstairs. The blackness of the man's figure standing out there was the only thing darker than the surrounding ambience. Finally, the man turned and walked past the window I was sitting by, seemingly circling to the back of the house. We tried to follow through the house, watching him through every window possible, until we lost him completely. We were in the den of the house, looking through the back window, but he was nowhere in sight. We had nothing to tell the police when they arrived, other than someone was standing at our front porch. They apparently had been in our Morton building, and they walked around back near the trees and disappeared. Nothing unusual was found in the Morton building, and they couldn't find the man anywhere on the property. They told us to call them back if we see them again, because realistically, there was nothing they could do. My grandma insisted we stay upstairs, and she would sleep down there for the night. Me and my brothers were playing on the GameCube that we brought along upstairs at around 10 o'clock when we heard my grandmother's heart-chilling scream coming from downstairs. We all panicked and sprinted all the way down to the den where we saw our grandma pointing into the pitch-black office. She said there was someone in there. I closed the door and told my brothers to help me lean up against it while Grandma once again called the cops. The cops arrived, and to our surprise, found the man laying on our grandma's office couch. He was very open about his intentions, spending the night in the warmth of the house. There were 2 windows that you couldn't exit from in that office, meaning the door we were blocking was the only exit. He admitted he simply entered the house through the den window, which was not locked. My grandma is 92 now. She's always been a skittish, worrisome little thing, but this event only made her that much more paranoid with just about everything. I was vacationing in the Bahamas when I was 14 with some family friends. My friend and I were getting some henna tattoos at the hotel, and there was this guy lingering around us, but we didn't think much of it because a lot of people would stop to see what was going on. After mine was done, I told my friend and her mom I was going to go back to the room to get ready for dinner. There were 2 ways to the other side of the hotel, either inside through a bunch of small stores or outside along the pool. I walked through the inside and got to the elevator, where I saw the guy who had been watching us already at the elevator. We got on together, and he gestured for me to choose my floor button first. I clicked it, but he didn't choose another floor. Alarms start going off in my head. But what could I do? I was stuck in an elevator. The elevator stopped on my floor, and I started walking to my room. In this hotel, most of the rooms faced the ocean, so to the right in this hallway were just windows. I was in the very last room on that floor, and I could see the guy following me about 10 feet behind. About 2 doors from my room, he ran up and grabbed me. I kicked and screamed, and he dropped onto the floor. I ran to the room and locked myself in. After talking with security and giving a description, they found the guy and found out that he had actually been following multiple younger women in the building. It was a few weeks ago. I took a trip with my wife Allison to a top of the mountains resort a few hours from our house. Out of respect for the family-run resort, I won't be mentioning the name. It was a couples weekend, so the itinerary would be heavily catered to adults rather than its usual family orientation. The resort had a very old-fashioned, country-ish feel to it. Everything was built from wood. Our room was huge. It was actually 2 rooms combined to 1, with the door that usually separates the 2 having been left open. The first night was actually a singles mingle night in the basement club just below the dining hall, even though it was meant to be a couples weekend. So we just played some late night shuffleboarding, conversed with a few other young couples, and drank at the bar for a bit while listening to an amateur musician playing guitar up on the stage. When we got back to our room at around 12:30, there was a rather disgusting smell. A new smell that wasn't there earlier. It smelled kind of skunky. Allison kind of playfully smacked my chest and accused me of smoking pot. However, I assured her I haven't even done so since I was in college. Allison went to the front desk in the main building and requested a different room. They denied the request as most of the rooms were booked, but they did send someone up to our room who agreed it smelled funky in there. The smell was mostly coming from the attached extra room that we weren't sleeping in. He offered us a partial discount to our bill for the inconvenience and sprayed some Febreze from the closet around the room. We took his suggestion to keep the door separating the 2 rooms closed, as a skunk might have gotten into the other room. We went to sleep shortly after, or at least tried to, as a few minutes after turning out the lights, Me and Allison both heard a consistent thud-like sound every few seconds coming from the left of the bed in an adjacent room. We tried to ignore it and just wait it out, hoping it would stop, but it just became too annoying. I was sure it was some kind of rodent making the noise in the next room over. I took a broom as a weapon and went into the connected room. I checked in the closet and under the bed. Nothing. The sound had stopped as well. I was heading back to our main room when I noticed something in the corner. I didn't turn my head fully in fear of what I knew I was going to see. But through my peripheral vision, I saw a very tall, black figure-type object in the corner of the room. After locking the door connecting the two rooms, we once again phoned the front desk, and they immediately sent the owner of the resort up with a gun. The door to the hallway on the other side of the room was open, meaning the thing I saw in the corner was a person, and they made a break for it as soon as I left the room. The owner actually told us that we were smart to call, as there had actually been some creeps coming to the resort, stealing food from the cafeteria and sneaking into people's rooms at night.
This happened about 7 years ago, ironically on Halloween night. It was pretty late, close to midnight, so all the kids in the neighborhood had already gone home. Even our neighbors across the way had stopped playing their corny Halloween tape. You know, the ones with the creaking door sounds and witch cackling. It was just me and my cousin Q, sitting in the living room. Now, my other cousin, who was about 4 years old, had left her doll laying on the floor, face down. It was one of those baby alive dolls or something like that. The ones with the moving eyelids. Q had issues with that doll the moment it was bought. She hated it and said it was creepy. In fact, she often threw it down the basement stairs. I had no problems with it, and so it stayed on the floor so my little cousin could pick it up in the morning. It was very quiet for about half an hour, until I heard a loud, rasping, shuffling noise that seemed to be coming from outside. It sounded like an older man right outside our window. I turned to Q, who looked back at me. "Did you hear that?" "It's probably the neighbor's tape again," she said. She went back to typing on her computer. It was silent for another minute before we heard the rasping noise again, louder this time. It sounded like the man was trying to say something. I got up from the couch and peeked out the window. Absolutely no one out there, not even in the street. Our neighbor's house was dark. It was as still as any night in our quiet neighborhood. "There's no one out there," I said, looking back to Q. She didn't say anything. I was kind of getting freaked out. Another minute passed, and this time there was whispering, but loud whispering. I remember it sounded like a kid and a woman. Q finally looked up from her computer. "It's that doll," she said. Of course she thought it was. She was very superstitious. I gave her a skeptic look. Let me say this, I don't believe in the paranormal. I leant down and picked up the doll. It was fine. Her eyes were closed. I forgot to say that it had a voice box thing in it, but it didn't have any batteries. I put it back down. "No, it's not. Just leave it alone," I told her. It was silent again. I went back to my seat on the couch. The rasping started again, and I heard the man say something garbled, followed by wheezing. I jumped up from the couch. I was going to see if it was coming from the backyard. Just as I started walking, I noticed that the doll had moved a little. I picked it up again and turned it over. Its eyes were open and it was heavier than before. I dropped it and Q threw it down the basement again. I still have no idea what to think. Q denies it ever happened, and my little cousin never asked about her doll after that. I saw the doll only one time after that, on the top basement step laying on its side. This time, I pushed it down the steps. I was up late reading on a cold night. My bedroom is on the first floor, and I live alone in a relatively quiet and wooded area. For that reason, a lot of my windows didn't have any blinds, since it wasn't as if people driving by were able to look into my house. Plus, I like waking up to the sunlight shining in my bedroom. But this one night made me regret never getting blinds in the bedroom. After finally shutting my reading lamp to get some shut-eye, I had a good 2 minutes of silence before I heard the sound of something hitting the window. It sounded like a single tap from a person's fist. I was facing away from the window and didn't want to turn around. I was used to hearing things like tree branches brush up against the walls and windows, but I distinctly recognized this sound to be a fist hitting glass. The thought that somebody might be outside my window watching me frightened me. The fact that somebody would walk all the way onto my property to my bedroom window. I tried to accept that maybe it was just a tree branch, but a second and single knock at the window confirms my fear. It was a fist hitting the glass, and somebody was outside my window. I figured that if I just ignored it, they would go away. Maybe it was just some punk trying to mess with me. If they thought I was sleeping, they would get bored. Another knock at the window came, and I desperately tried to just stay still and show no reactions. But when the fourth knock came routinely, I decided enough was enough. I should confront this jerk like a real man. I turned to the window, and just barely caught a glimpse of a black shadow quickly moving under the window. For some reason, actually seeing something at the window killed any courage I had, and I ran to the kitchen phone and called the police. They said they would have an officer over in 10 minutes. When I hung up, I saw something in the corner of my eye. I turned my head and saw somebody standing outside my kitchen window, surely looking at me. Only for a second though, because as soon as I noticed, he took off. Somebody was watching me through all the windows. Then I received a disturbing phone call. It was my neighbor, who also happens to be my best friend. He happened to notice through his window that 3 people dressed in black walked onto my property earlier, one of them with a sharp, shiny object in his hand. This only made me panic even more. I ran upstairs where I knew I couldn't be watched and hid in the bathroom. I heard constant single knocks at the front door downstairs. No way it was the police. I just prayed they would get there in time, and thankfully, moments after the knocking stopped, I heard heavy banging at the front door, followed by someone screaming police. It turned out to be the cops, but whoever the 3 men were already gone into the woods. It might have been more than 3, I don't even know. All I know is they were never caught, and that I went out to get blinds the same week. My parents are divorced, and I was living with my dad. I'm an only child, so the only time I was around kids my own age was when I was out making friends with kids on the block. There was this one kid that lived on the corner of my block. His name was Tom. I met him while riding my bike. He strangely invited me over to shoot some hoops with him, so I did. He was a lot older than me. I was 12 and he was 16. I found out after hanging out with him a lot that he was an only child as well, and that he also lived with his dad. At first, I found him very relatable. I gave him my phone number and he would call to hang out. Sometimes he would come over and play video games. But then he started getting weird. He would call non-stop. If I didn't answer, he would begin to leave annoyed messages. He would call 5 or 6 times before coming over and ringing the bell. If my dad wasn't home, I usually didn't answer it. But when he was home, he would force me to hang out with Tom, even though I told him he was creepy. I biked with Tom back down to his house while pretending to listen to him babble on about stupid shit. This kid would never shut up. I needed to find a way to get him to stop looking for me. Then, for the first time, he invited me into his house. I really didn't want to go in, but it didn't seem I had a choice. The second I walked into the door, the foul, disgusting odor of his house filled my lungs. Clothes were tossed all over the floor, broken glass in one corner of the room, and what looked like coffee stains on the wall. It was the most disgusting place I'd ever seen. And then, a huge, shady-looking man walked out from another room. He looked at me with a very intimidating look. I felt myself backing up away from him, until Tom introduced him as his father. The man just gave me a big grunt and stomped off into another room. It was official, this kid was a fucking creep. I needed to get away from him for good. I decided I didn't even want to be in that house anymore and just made up some excuse to go. I think that I said that I forgot I had a doctor's appointment, and at that moment, his smile slowly faded as an unhappy, if not extremely angry expression crossed his face. He didn't even give me any response. He just looked at me with this unnerving stare. I left in a hurry and ran back down the block to my house. The door was locked, surprisingly. I unlocked it with the key my dad made me carry and found that he wasn't home. I really wanted him to be home. And then I found a little sticky note on the fridge saying he was called into work for a possible storm emergency. So that night before going to sleep, I checked my email for a response from somebody on eBay. But instead, I had about 5 new emails all titled in capital letters, and they were all sent from an email named TomTom20@AOL.com. It was him. I never gave him my email and still have no idea how he got it. One of the emails was titled, "You made a mistake." Another was titled, "I know where you live." And the rest were filled with profanity and threats. I was only 12 and was extremely intimidated by this, so I was ready to call my dad, but as soon as I was heading to the kitchen phone, I heard the sound of rustling bushes outside. I opened the blinds of the window that was facing the bushes, and was greeted by the face of a huge man who I instantly recognized as Tom's dad. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, he was already gone. When my dad came home early because of this situation, we went on to get a restraining order as soon as possible. Tom and his dad moved out about a month after that. I moved into a house that my aunt and uncle had been renting out for several years after they built a new place. I spent a few months alone before a buddy from work asked if I was looking for a roommate. I thought about it for a few days and ended up allowing him to move in. It was a 2-bedroom place with a den and office in the garage. He decided he wanted his own space as the bedrooms were right next to each other, so he moved his stuff into the office in the garage. And I have to admit, it was a pretty cool setup he had. The only problem, he didn't have a bathroom or kitchen out there, so he would use the kitchen and toilet in the house. We worked different schedules, so I would often leave the house unlocked for him. One night, I went to my girlfriend's house for dinner. After I got back, I decided to grab a 6-pack of beer I had bought the previous night. When I opened the fridge, my beer was gone. I assumed it was my roommate and went into a blind rage. I stormed out into the garage and slammed his bedroom door open. He was sleeping and rolled over. I screamed at him, asking why he drank my beer without asking. He said he didn't touch my beer and rubbed the sleep out of his eyes. Having lived with him for a while, I was pretty good at judging when he was lying. I felt he was telling the truth. My heart sank as I came to the realization that somebody had stolen our beer from the fridge and whatever else. We went back into the house and made sure everything was in its place. The TV was there, all the furniture. It wasn't until I went into my bedroom and realized my $2,000 laptop was gone that we began to panic. My buddy called the cops and we searched high and low for the beer and laptop, thinking I might have misplaced them. We soon gave up and began to search the yard for whoever had done this. We didn't live alone in this house though. There was a room that had been built on several years after the house was built. My aunt's dying mother spent her last couple of years living there, as it was easy for my aunt and uncle to care for her during her sickness. When she died, they began to rent the room out to a strange woman, before eventually moving out themselves and renting the rest of the house out. The woman remained there until we moved in, and my aunt and uncle had their concerns with her. They believed she was a drug addict, which became evident to us during our stay there. She behaved erratically, and we would hear strange noises from her end of the house all hours of the night. Her brother moved in several months after we did, which was strange because her place was a one-bedroom suite. We figured he just slept on the couch or something. He was even weirder than her, though. He wouldn't acknowledge me when I pulled up into the driveway while he was sitting having a smoke. Trying to make conversation with the guy was pointless. He basically just stared through your soul. One night he even asked my roommate if he could score him drugs. That night during our search for the burglar, we went out to the garage door, only to find bare footprints in the snow. The footprints led from their suite door to our garage door. We put two and two together and began banging on their door. We said we knew it was him, and he'd better answer the door. Someone inside lifted the curtain and made eye contact with me, which to this day still gives me chills. The cops showed up and took down all our information. They scoured the house and found nothing, and no one. We showed them the footprints and explained that the people living in the suite were drug addicts. We gave the officers their names. They ran their names in their cruiser and came back to inform us that the man had a warrant in another province and was convicted of breaking and entering several years back. The cops knocked on their door for several minutes and identified themselves as police officers, to no avail. They informed us that because the warrant was from out of province, and technically the man hadn't committed a crime, there was nothing they could do about it. The cops left and it was 1 a.m., so my roommate and I went to bed. The door that connects the two weirdos' suite and my part of the house can only be locked from their side of the door. I completely forgot about this before falling asleep. During the night, I heard footsteps outside my door and a few loud bangs. My doorknob began to shake violently. I was barely awake and brushed it off as my roommate. Luckily, I always lock my bedroom door at night. The next morning, I asked my roommate what was so important at 3 a.m. that he would need to try and get in my room. He told me he slept through the night and hadn't even got up to go to the bathroom. My heart sank. I told him what had happened during the night. I have never been more glad that I locked my door at night, due to some silly childhood fear that I've held onto into adulthood. To this day, I wonder what would have happened if I left my bedroom door open and that man got into my room. Needless to say, me and my buddy moved out of that place a few weeks later. It happened on my friend's 21st birthday. We were throwing him a big party filled with alcohol. There were a lot of people I didn't know there. It was just chaotic in the house. There were probably 100 people. But even in all the chaos, I noticed one shady character that stood out. There was an older man sitting in the corner of the room, just kind of watching everybody drinking and dancing. I didn't think much about it at first, assuming it was someone's dad or uncle or something. But as the night died down, and more than half of the guests had already left, the man was still there by himself in the corner. At that point, I asked one of my friends who that guy was, and he said he had no idea. We decided to wait until most of the guests had left, figuring maybe he would too. And when the last of the guests were gone, we went back into the living room, and surely enough, he was gone. I felt relieved immediately, even though it wasn't even my house. That man just seemed so out of place, and it was downright creepy. Me and a couple of other friends slept over that night. I slept on the couch in the den. Falling asleep was easy with all the alcohol running through my veins, but staying asleep was a problem. I woke up in the middle of the night, feeling insanely thirsty and having to go to the bathroom. I first went to the bathroom since it was closer, and then went up to the kitchen and got a glass of water. When I went back down to the den and laid back down on the couch, I noticed that the sliding door to the coat closet across from the couch had been slightly slit open. It was too dark to see anything else though, like anything inside of it. I felt a chill run down my spine as I remembered the creepy man sitting in the corner. The idea of that man hiding in the closet immediately popped into mind. I continued to lay still, under the assumption that he was watching me through the open door of the closet. I began to plan my escape. I could jump over the other couch and land right next to the stairway upstairs to the living room. but I just had to gather up the courage to do it. Then I saw the closet door slide open a little more, and that's when I got the courage to run for it. I jumped over the couch and ran up the stairs. I could hear the closet door fully slide open and somebody running after me. I screamed at my friends who were on the couches to wake up. All three of my friends that were in the living room woke up and looked at me as if I were crazy. I knew that we now outnumbered him 4-1, so I looked at the stairs and waited, but he never came up. My friends demanded an explanation, so I told them that the creepy man from earlier was hiding in the coat closet, and he almost chased me up the stairs. Just then, we heard the back door from down in the den open up, and we all looked at each other. We called the cops, but the man was never found. He simply left through the back door. When I was going to college in North Carolina, I started working at a local TJ Maxx store for some extra cash. Since I was in class during the day, I usually worked the later shifts. One night I was walking to my car. I think it was about 11 or 11:30. As a safety protocol, all of the employees left together and the security guard would watch from the sidewalk to make sure we all got to our cars all right. I was approaching my car when I heard a car pull up behind me. I turned around and there was a woman with her teenage daughter in the passenger seat. She rolled the window down and started giving me a story about how they just came into town to visit family and that they're out of gas and have no money, and then asked if they could borrow a few dollars. I told them the truth, which was that I had no cash on me. I never carry cash. So she just looked at me and asked very hurriedly if I would get into the car with them, go to the gas station, and buy them about $10 worth of gas. I mean, obviously I said no, and she asked a few more times. It wasn't until I had said no that I noticed the daughter in the passenger seat had been staring at me the whole time, and she was licking her lips and wringing her fingers. At that point, I bolted back to the store where the security guard was, because they had pulled up behind my car, so I would have been stuck there. I told him what had happened. He started walking to their car, and they sped away. Working the night shift always sucked. I work in an office building and would constantly do the night shifts since it was the only time it would work out for me. I was just about always the only person on the floor I worked on, possibly in the whole building. There would always be a kind of eerie feeling to being in such a big building with most of the lights out and absolutely no one around. But on the upside, it was peaceful and less stressful, and I was able to get a lot of work done. There was this one night though. It was a Friday night, around 2 in the morning. I was typing away on my keyboard when I heard a noise from outside my cubicle. It sounded like just a random crack from the walls or something. It's unusual in this building, but I didn't get too concerned about it. I resumed typing away and was once again interrupted by a sound. This time, the sound of a computer starting up. It caught me off guard. I was sure nobody else was working the night shift. I stood up on my chair to get a view over the cubicle walls. The glare of a computer screen in the dark was visible in a cubicle on the opposite side of the room. Then I did something stupid, something I regret. I asked if there was anybody there in a yell, hoping to get an answer from a fellow employee, but instead, I saw the glaring light of the computer monitor across the room turn off, and there was once again nothing but darkness on that side of the room. I started getting nervous. I turned off the lamp and computer screen so that I wouldn't give away my position to whoever that was. I crouched down and tiptoed out across to a nearby cubicle. There was just utter silence. I sat waiting for something to happen for God knows how long, but I eventually decided the coast was clear. I tiptoed down past all the cubicles until I reached the opening near the exit door to the stairs and elevators, and that's when I realized that my fearful suspicion was true. There was a man crouched down behind a plant in the corner of the room, dressed in all black. I felt my heart sink as I noticed him, but it didn't seem like he knew that I noticed him. I turned back to the stairway door. There was no way I was going to wait for the elevator and take a chance. I casually opened the door and closed it behind me, proceeding to walk down the stairs. After making it down about 2 flights of stairs, I heard the door above me push open aggressively, followed by manic echoing footsteps coming fast down the stairs. I raced down the stairs, running as fast as I could, all while the footsteps above me were getting louder. I finally made it to the first floor, raced through the lobby, and out the front door. Whoever was in there didn't follow me. I immediately called the cops, along with one of my bosses. My boss said no one was scheduled to work except for me. The cops scanned the place from top to bottom. There was no one in there. I couldn't help them out with any description other than he was wearing all black. I did continue to do the night shift for about a week after that, with my boss allowing me to lock all possible entrances to the floor, including the elevators. But I still wasn't comfortable with it, so ever since, I've been doing the day shifts. It was 4 a.m. on a Saturday night. I woke up to my stomach rumbling, and nothing is worse than trying to sleep on an empty stomach. So I got out of bed and made my way to the kitchen to make a sandwich. But immediately I noticed that the cabinet was open. I'm always super obsessive over closing everything I open, so I couldn't believe that I had done that. I found it more odd than most people would. That's just how I am. Most people would shut the cabinet and forget about it, but I went as far as investigating around the house for any unwanted guests. There was nobody in any of the closets I checked, but when I went down to the den, the back door was wide open. I was certain now that someone had been in my house. I somehow had the balls to step outside and turn on the patio light, and there was somebody sitting in one of the patio chairs. He looked at me with a blank expression and got up slowly. He looked filthy, almost homeless. His hair was down to his shoulders. He started walking closer to me. I couldn't tell what his intentions were, and I kinda just stood there, almost taking him as harmless. But he suddenly lunged at me, and I barely had time to shut the door and lock it. We stared each other down for 10 seconds through the glass, until I finally realized I should be taking that time to call the cops. I ran to the kitchen to get the phone, and as I was dialing, I noticed when I got back that he was already gone. I still called the cops, but nothing was ever found of the man. This is a very weird story that took place a few months ago. I still live in the same house this happened in. I have an electrical outlet under my bed that I use to charge my phone with. I leave my phone up on the ledge above my bed every night, usually using it as an alarm. However, something strange started happening on a Monday night in February. I woke up to my alarm clock blasting. Only it was still dark out. I looked at my actual alarm clock sitting on my desk. It was 4 in the morning. I wasn't sure if I'd accidentally set a new alarm. The alarm was titled Down. I unset it and went back to sleep, not overthinking it. The next night, I woke up again to the sound of my phone's alarm clock blasting. I saw that the time was 3 in the morning, and the alarm clock title was set to Beneath. No way had I set that alarm. I would remember something like that. I figured my brother was playing a joke on me somehow. The next morning, I told my dad to tell him to stop messing with my alarm clock, that it's interrupting my actual sleep on school nights. But he swore on his life that he had never touched it, and I kinda believed him. That night, I put a password on my phone and wrote it on a sticky note just for safekeeping. I hid the sticky note on the wall behind my bed and made sure no extra alarms were set. The only one was set for 8 a.m. I fell asleep, but once again, I woke up to the blasting alarm clock in total darkness. 2 a.m. The alarm was titled The. I was a little freaked out now. Something was really wrong with my phone. I was sure someone was hacking into it. The next day I left it off for the whole day in hopes that whoever was messing with it would forget about it. And that night I used my actual alarm clock on my desk as an alarm instead. I set it to 8 a.m. and went to sleep, but when I woke up, there was once again no sunlight. My alarm clock was off, so I couldn't see the time. It was my phone. It had been moved to the ledge. But the alarm clock sound wasn't the usual marimba. It was some kind of distorted screaming sound. I turned off the alarm, which was titled Bed. It was 1 in the morning. I was laying there clueless, not knowing what to think. My phone was at 10%, so I reached down under my bed to try and find the charger that's normally plugged into the wall. It was missing. And then, at the worst possible time, I realized exactly what it all meant. The 4 alarm titles formed a sentence: down beneath the bed. I tried to pull my arm away, but it was too late. I felt a hand grab my arm and squeeze tight. I screamed as loud as I could, loud enough for all the neighbors to hear. I heard my parents' bedroom door open and footsteps running over to my room. My door opened and my dad barged in with a baseball bat. He saw that I was being pulled down to the edge of my bed. My dad reached under my bed and grabbed a hold of the man hiding under. He knocked him out with the bat and called the cops. The man clearly didn't plan that out, as he basically trapped himself under my bed. Police told us that he was a registered sex offender who had been arrested 10 times. He's extremely messed up in the head and clearly gains pleasure from messing with and scaring his victims. It scares me the most that he was in our house and under my bed for 4 days. The most horrifying experience that ever happened to me didn't even directly happen to me. I have a friend that I'll call Ty. We would hang out or at least text every day, but there was this one day that he didn't respond to any of my texts or calls. I went over to his house, which was a block away, to see if he was alright. I knocked and rang, but he didn't answer, which was weird because his car was there. I got the feeling he wanted to be left alone. But late that night, I got a FaceTime request from an unknown number. I cautiously answered it with the camera aimed away from my face. A face popped up on the screen, and it was Ty. I felt so relieved and showed my face. When I got a little better look at his face, I noticed he looked different. Like, a lot more tired and, I don't know, paranoid, I guess. And he was also in an unfamiliar room. I asked him where he was and why he wasn't answering, to which he responded that he was fine and he was at home. I asked him whose phone he was using, and he just took a long pause before answering. He just blankly stared at the camera until finally answering that he was using his uncle's phone. That was really weird, but before I could question him further, he all of a sudden demands that I lend him $10,000 and that he'll pay me back. I can't help but laugh at this until I see that he's serious. More than just serious. His facial expression filled with what looked like worry. I asked him why the hell he needed so much money, and there was once again a huge pause, with him just staring into the camera. He finally says he has to go, and with that, the call ended. It was probably one of the weirdest and most unnerving experiences of my life. I had never seen him act so weird. Something was clearly wrong with him. But it was late, and I figured I would just go over to his house tomorrow and talk with him. The next day, first thing in the morning, I went straight over to his house and rang the doorbell about 10 times. He didn't answer. I eventually gave it up as a lost cause. If he wanted to act sketchy, that was his problem. But late that night, around the same time, I received another FaceTime call from another unknown number. I answered it, and it was again Ty. But this time, he looked like shit. His hair was a mess. He had a cut on his forehead. He had bags under his eyes. I didn't understand what the hell was wrong with him. He wouldn't tell me anything. He just kept demanding $10,000 to be paid to some random address, to which I kept telling him no. And then he said something that still haunts me. He said in a shaky, nervous voice, "Come on, don't point a gun at my back." It hit me like a bullet as he said this, accompanied with an ever so slightly twitch of his left eye, to which I interpreted as a wink. But then, the call ended abruptly, and I can only imagine what was going to happen to him. By some miracle, I remembered the address and sent the cops there right away. It was an old abandoned house on a basically deserted block miles away from my house. They found Ty in the basement, beaten senseless and barely alive, but they got to him just in time. The sicko that did this to him was already long gone. Ty doesn't like to talk about it, but the most he told me was that he was walking home before everything went black, and he woke up in a dark basement. Number 3. My dad has been an MTA Transit subway station manager for 35 years. With this job, there has to be a manager on duty at all times, so he's practically done every single possible shift throughout his career. That means he's done his fair share of night shifts. Most trains were completely empty throughout the night. He said it was the only nice part about doing the night shift. He has a series of funny and weird night shift stories to tell, but there's one downright horrifying one. My dad had just boarded the train to move to his office at another station. He was alone when he got on, which was at about 3 in the morning. At the next station, someone boarded. My dad describes him as a white, tall and skinny man, wearing a heavy jacket and beanie. He shot my dad a quick glance before sitting in the furthest corner away from him. My dad said that he felt uncomfortable as the guy kept looking up at him every so often. When my dad's stop came, he got off, as well as the other man. He walked to his office door, unlocked it, and looked behind him. The man in the jacket was pacing around only about 50 feet away. My dad stepped into his office, shut the door, locked it, and sat at his desk. 5 minutes later, someone started to try and turn the doorknob. After the person on the other side of the door realized it was locked, they started to knock softly. My dad called out, "Who is it?" And they responded, "I want to talk." He told whoever it was to go away. He says he knew trouble when he saw it. He had a good feeling it was the guy from the train, as this station at a time like this was apparently always completely empty. My dad told the guy to go away. He continued to knock for a good 5 minutes. My dad finally pulled up the security camera screens and brought up the camera pointed to his office door. Sure enough, there was the guy from the train, wearing the jacket and beanie. Coincidentally, as soon as my dad brought up the camera, the man walked away. So my dad did whatever his work consisted of for about half an hour in that office. Before leaving to catch the next train, he checked the camera to make sure that the weird guy wasn't out there. He locked up and walked down the stairs to the train platform, where he got on the train right away. Looking out the window, he saw the guy from before walking down the stairs to the platform and then stepping on the train into the same car as my dad. He sat down on the opposite side, a few seats to the right. My dad tried to look away and pretend not to notice him, but he knew the guy was staring at him. He at one point gave in and stared back, giving a slight nod and smile in some sort of truce attempt before looking away again. The man stared at my dad the whole ride to the next station, but my dad never looked back at him once after the first time. Now you may be asking, why didn't he try to forcibly get the guy to back off? Well, despite my dad's intimidating size, he's always been a complete teddy bear, no bark and no bite. Plus, he says he feared that guy was armed and that one small motion could lead to death. When the train stopped at the station, my dad practically ran all the way back up to the streets, constantly glancing over his shoulder, and yes, the man from the train was following him. My dad had to find the first public building still open to try and escape. He found a Wendy's that was open and stepped inside. He sat and watched as the guy following him walked up to the window, stopped, and stared my dad down through the glass for about 10 seconds before turning around and walking across the street and then down the sidewalks. My dad said he ate, waited a little longer, then left the Wendy's to get to his third and final station for the night. The scariest part, when my dad was in his third office, as he was checking the security cameras out of the paranoia of the situation, he caught the guy from the train pacing around the outside, only about 30 feet from his office. He then stopped, looked up at the camera, and according to my dad, literally froze and stared for no less than a minute. When he finally lowered his head, he walked away out of the station to never be seen by my dad again. My dad doesn't know if he was followed after leaving the Wendy's, but that would only make sense. The guy was clearly disturbed, possibly homeless and or dangerous, and who knows what he actually wanted with my dad. Number 2. Me and my 3 friends were in New York around Christmas time. We didn't finally decide to leave until about maybe 2 in the morning. We got on the first train that we could catch, and as expected, it was empty. We were pretty sobered up by then. Then there was a sudden commotion in the next car over. We had peeked through the glass in between the cars, and there were 2 hooded men, or maybe teenagers, standing obnoxiously close to a woman sitting in one of the seats who was screaming for help. I suggested that we go over and kick their asses, but as me and a buddy got a closer look, we saw they were armed with handguns. I pushed all my friends to get to the next car over, away from the armed men. I took a look back and saw one of the men pointing at us before starting to follow. We ran through at least 3 different cars with the men following us before the train finally stopped at the next station. We all booked it through the old station to the nearest place we could hide. I got separated from my friends, so I went to hide behind a garbage can. I could hear my chaser's shoes hitting the tiled floors, so I knew I had no time to find a better hiding spot. I peeked through the opening at the top of the bin. I could get a better look at them now. One was black, the other was Indian, and they were both really young looking. I was sure they were only trying to rob us, until I heard one of them say, "If you find them, kill them." I hope you understand why I almost gave away my position in reaction to hearing this. With a gasp and almost pulling the garbage bin down with me as I returned to cover, I consider it a miracle neither of them caught me. They left the area. I took notice that they didn't have their guns drawn at that moment. I ran in the opposite direction of the 2 and quickly caught my friends who were waving me over from behind a large pole. I took cover with them behind another pole not far from that one, and we waited for as long as we thought necessary. The big shock to this story, though, was when we caught glimpse of the woman from the train, who we thought was being threatened by the 2 men, walking over in the direction of the men and then calling something along the lines of, "Where are they? Don't tell me you didn't get them." The 2 men reappeared from beyond a corner, walking over to the woman. The rest of what they said was too low to pick up on. They walked back down the stairs to the platforms, and as we could guess, waited for another train to run their trap again. At the very least, we called the police and reported what was going on, but I have no idea if they were ever caught. Number 1. My name is Danny, I'm 22 years old, and this was the most horrifying experience of my life. I live and work in New York City, but I don't have a car, so my main mode of transportation is the subway. It was a Saturday night. I was on my way home from a party in the middle of the night. I did this about every other weekend, so I was completely fine with taking the subway alone at night. Walking down the steps, entering the underground without a soul in sight, it was always a bit chilling. This specific station was very tightly spaced. As I was walking, I could almost feel as if I were being watched or followed, along with the occasional echoing bang-type sound emitting from an unknown location. I was early for the train, so I sat on a bench and waited. This is something straight out of a horror movie. I heard this exact phrase. "Psst, over here, buddy." There was somebody standing on the tracks inside the tunnel, poking his head out and looking at me. It was a filthy-looking man, I'd say in his early 40s. He gave me a smile, a horrible yellow smile with at least 3 teeth missing, and I could tell that even from where I was sitting. I did the best I could to pay no attention to him, but he wouldn't go away. There was laughing coming from inside the tunnel, and then another disgusting-looking man stuck his face out as well. This man gave me a nasty smile as well, before telling me to come hang out with them in the tunnel. The way they stared at me, though, their eyes wouldn't even move. It's as if their sight was locked onto me. I resumed doing the best I could to ignore them and just wait for the train. I noticed in my peripheral vision that one of the men moved away into the tunnel, returning moments later with another face. I had to look again. There was a third face, but this one was hunched over and lifeless. It looked like one of the men were holding the guy's face up. The sound of the train approaching felt like 1,000 pounds off my shoulders. I got up ready to board the train, but when I got closer to the edge of the platform, I nearly threw up at the sight. The two men were going back into the tunnel, but the second man in the back was holding something in his hand. A head. Just a head. Like a decapitated head. They disappeared from sight onto the side of the tunnel. As the train stopped, I got into the first car, planning on warning the conductor, but no later than after we left the station. I didn't want to be there a second longer. As the train began to move, I saw legs moving down the stairs to the platform, but that was it. I didn't get to see who it was. But what I did get to see, as the train moved into the tunnels, I caught a glimpse of a group of men, hunched up against the railing, inches away from the train window, and they were all looking right at me. I knocked on the conductor's door like a madman, screaming it was an emergency. He opened up and I explained what I just saw. He radioed to somebody in charge of the station, as well as another higher-up of the company, who I'm sure took care of it, or contacted the proper authorities or security, whatever. It seemed to take ages for my stop to come, but when it did, I practically had a hop in my walk from relief. I have since been to one party at the same friend's house, but I skipped that station. I decided it was worth it to take the extra long walk to the next station. I don't know if weird shit happens often in the subway at night. In my experience prior to this incident, it never did. But after this experience, I think I should say you should be extremely cautious when in an isolated place like a subway station late at night.
I am 14 and my friend is 15. One night my friend asked me if I wanted to spend the night, so I did. His mom was at work and his dad was at the gym. Me and my friend were upstairs in his room playing video games. We kept hearing what sounded like scratching noises and slight banging. We thought nothing of it because he has a dog, so we kept playing our video game. Minutes later we heard the noises again, but they were louder, and so we went to go see if it was the dog. It couldn't be the dog because it was lying outside his parents' room. Fearing someone was trying to break in, we grabbed our knives and flashlights. We searched all the rooms upstairs, then went downstairs, searching it with only our flashlights. We decided it would be best to search his backyard, although we don't know how someone would get in his backyard because it's fenced in and there's a deep drop-off on the other side of the fence at the back. The search came up empty. I convinced my friend we should search the front of his house and make our way around his fence. We went around front and he went left and I went right. On the right his fence connects to his neighbor's, so I went over to him to find him frozen with his light shined in the direction of the woods near the drop-off. I was weirded out and shined my light in the direction of his to find a guy dressed from head to toe in all black, frozen and staring at us. At this moment, I yelled run and we bolted inside the house and called 911. We waited and minutes later 2 officers arrived to find nothing and they told us to call them again if anything happens. Me and my friend were instructed by his parents to stay inside and downstairs in case anything happens, so we did. About an hour later, me and him were sitting downstairs on the couch and he out of nowhere asked, "Did you see that?" "See what?" He then said, "The light. Someone shined a light through the window over the fence." About a second after he said that, I saw a beam of light shine through the window. So we called 911 once again, and the officers showed up minutes later and yet again found nothing. Me and my friend at this point were paranoid and waited until his dad showed up and we took him outside to the backyard where we all heard footsteps. His dad convinced us that it was just a hunter, so we went to bed with no more problems. Unfortunately, it doesn't end there. My friend asked me about 2 weeks later if I wanted to spend the night again, and I did. Later that night, his parents were both still at work. We were joking around about what had happened with what we thought was the hunter, as his dog was outside doing its business. While we were talking, I peeked out the back door to check on his dog to find what looked to be someone peeking over the fence, so we immediately called his dog in and locked the door. We left it alone, and minutes later, as we were in his room, we heard noises, so I looked out his window to once again see what looked like a guy peeking over the fence. So we grabbed knives and flashlights once again and went in the backyard and shined the flashlight in the direction we thought we saw the person. The light illuminated the outline of a head at the area of the fence we thought we saw the guy. We ran inside and called 911 and they responded. Minutes later they showed up and again found nothing and sat at the area outside the fence near the woods for 5 minutes in case something happened. Nothing happened, so they left and they told us to call back if anything happened. We didn't tell his parents this time because we thought they wouldn't believe us. Me and my friend returned upstairs to his room, and about 2 hours later, we heard the loudest banging ever. It started from the downstairs on the left side and went to the front door. We freaked out, we grabbed the dog and barricaded ourselves in his parents' room and got his dad's gun out in case we needed it. We then called 911, and again the police showed up and found no one and no sign of anyone and left. That was the last time we ever had that problem, and it still has us scared to this day. I was 14 years old, hanging out with my friend Jesse, who was also 14. We were in the living room playing Call of Duty. His parents weren't home for the night, so we were being as loud as we wanted. We were doing nothing but playing video games and eating junk food all night. And eventually, since his parents weren't home, he convinced me to just stay over for the night. So after Jesse went upstairs to go to the bathroom, I went downstairs to call my mom in private and tell her I would be staying over. By the time I got back upstairs, Jesse was back, and he just stared at me with a confused look on his face. I asked him what was wrong, and he said he thought that I was upstairs as he thought he heard someone in the bedroom next to the bathroom. I assured him I was downstairs making a phone call, and he just looked back upstairs with a concerned look. He walked upstairs and I followed him. He stopped at the door to the bedroom and put his ear up against it. He then opened the door and peeked into the room. It was dark, but I could see there was enough light in there to be able to scan the room. We didn't see anything, so he shut the door. I told him he was being paranoid as we went back downstairs to play more video games. We turned the volume back up loud and resumed playing. After the match ended, the loading screen came up, along with the silence that usually accompanies loading screens. That's when me and Jesse both looked at each other. Jesse hit the mute button as we listened to what we were sure was somebody grunting from upstairs in that bedroom. But soon after the silence from the television, there was silence from upstairs as well. Jesse whispered to me that someone is hiding up there. They must have stopped making the noise as soon as there was silence down here. Jesse whispered to me that we need to leave through the back door right now as it was much quieter than the front door. I agreed, and we headed outside to the back door. As soon as we were outside, Jesse got on the phone with the police as I looked up to the bedroom window. For some stupid reason, I turned on the flashlight on my phone and aimed it up to the window. About 3 seconds later, my heart dropped as someone stepped into view from behind the glass, but only for a brief moment. They seemed to crouch down under the window after spotting us. Jesse saw it too. That's when we actually took off down the block. We only came back when we saw a police car parked outside with its lights on. Jesse unlocked the front door for the 2 cops and they went inside to investigate. As me and Jesse were outside waiting by the car, we saw him. Him, as in the guy who was surely at the window. He was coming out from the backyard, walking really fast, yet also clearly trying to keep quiet. This man was really tall, like 6'5" or something, and he looked to be mid-40s. Me and Jesse ran inside and screamed for the cops to come outside, but by that time he was gone, and we had no idea which direction he could have gone in. Inside of the bedroom that the man was in, a giant clothes bag had been pulled out from under the bed with certain articles of clothing obviously missing. There was also money missing from the desk drawer, and the desktop computer had been turned on. We never saw or heard of this man again. This took place in the summer of 2008 when I was 12 years old. I was sleeping over at my friend Calvin's house. I can't remember every little detail about what was going on, but I remember Calvin's family came home unexpectedly early, and things were getting a bit hectic in the house. So we came up with this cute little idea of pitching a tent up in the backyard and sleeping out there for fun. We figured why not since it was warm out anyway. We pitched the tent in like 15 minutes with Calvin's backyard nightlight giving us enough light in the dark. Now on one side of Calvin's backyard beyond the fence was about 100 yards of nothing but trees. We lived in the country in New Jersey. Anyway, after goofing around for a while, Calvin turned off the nightlight and we finally went to sleep. Now I don't know about everyone else, but I cannot for the life of me fall asleep in sleeping bags or let alone anything but my bed. I was twisting and turning for like 3 hours trying to fall asleep in that thing. Sometime during the night, I started to hear a little rattly, creaky type sound coming from around the fence. It gave me chills at first, naturally. I wanted to wake Calvin up, but I didn't. It sounded like the wooden fence was being pushed or it was just moving. It was a bit windy out after all, but still, nevertheless, being the only one awake outside in a pretty rural area, and hearing a weird sound would make anyone uneasy. I tried to ignore it for the longest time, rolling around for like 3 hours hearing nothing but the sound of the wind, to then hearing a constant strange sound was just too weird, and I was getting downright freaked out. I felt the urge to pee coming on, and I didn't really want to go out there without knowing Calvin was awake. So I woke him up and told him to listen to that noise. Of course he thought it was just the wind, but as long as he was awake, I did feel better about leaving the tent. I unzipped the tent and naturally looked in the direction of the noise. I couldn't really see anything, it was too dark, so I walked over and flicked on the nightlight switch. When I looked at the fence, I saw there was a person leaning on the fence with his head down, seemingly pushing the fence. I immediately turned the light off and practically dove into the tent. I whispered to Calvin what I saw, and as we both fell silent, we realized that the noise had stopped. I told Calvin to call his house phone as quietly as possible, but he said we should run straight for the back door. I agreed. He unzipped the tent as quietly as possible and opened the little door, and when he ran out of the tent, he screamed. In reaction, I jumped out from the tent and ran straight for the back door as well, not looking behind me. When I asked Calvin why he screamed like that, his response scared me. He told me he saw somebody standing right by the side of the tent in arm's reach. The rest of the night we slept in Calvin's room upstairs, and I could swear, with the window open, I could still hear the creaky fence being pushed, but every time I looked, I couldn't see anyone out there.
I'm currently in a predicament, and quite frankly, I don't know what to do. I'll start from the beginning. 5 years ago, my next-door neighbor Charlie, or Charles as we call him, informed us of his 14-year-old son's disappearance. He reported it to the police, it was on the news, it was everywhere. Me and my wife felt absolutely awful and always offered to help them out in any way we could. As the years passed with no word of their son, we assumed they eventually came to terms with it, and realized the worst had probably happened. Me and my wife never had the nerve to ask if the body ever turned up. Occasionally Charles and his wife would invite me and my wife over for a barbecue during the warmer months. We noticed neither of the two were ever the same since their son had gone missing. Charles' wife Kathy was always quieter and more reserved, and Charles just seemed more awkward and nervous, both understandable to a certain extent. Fast forward a couple of years later to just last week. Charles came over to me when I was taking out the garbage and asked to borrow a shovel. Without hesitation, I ran to get him my best shovel, not asking why he needed it. He thanked me and said he just had to do some work in his backyard and he'd get it back to me by tomorrow. He then disappeared into his backyard. I went inside, and when I was by one of my upstairs windows that has a clear view into Charlie's backyard, I could see he was digging out a really big hole in the ground. He seemed to be struggling a bit. He's 56 after all. I figured I'd go grab my second shovel and help him out. As I entered his backyard and called his name, he looked up from what he was doing, dropped my shovel, and hurried over to me, saying, No, it's okay, Tim, I got it. Please, just leave." I said, "What's wrong with you? It's not a big deal." Mainly because of his bizarre reaction. He told me I will not allow you to use that shovel in my backyard, and then pointed to the gate as if I were a dog. I was so taken aback by how he was acting that I just left without saying another word. I went upstairs to spy on him through the window. He was digging the hole for at least another half hour. When it finally looked like he was done, he started looking around, like up high at neighboring houses as if to check and make sure nobody was watching. And then, before I could think to hide, he spotted me at my window. All I could do at that point was casually walk away. He's up to something, and I wanted to find out what. I continued to look at his backyard every so often, but he wasn't digging anymore. I figured he knew I was watching now and would wait until it was dark out. And I was exactly right. At 1:30 in the morning, I heard the sound of a shovel hitting the dirt outside. It was too dark to see anything from my window now, so I snuck outside quietly and looked over the fence in the backyard. I could see him digging loud and clear now. When he went inside his house, I took that opportunity to sneak into his backyard and take a look at what was in the hole he was digging. The moonlight alone revealed a small piece of a black garbage bag protruding from the dirt at the bottom of the hole. I looked at his back door and back at the hole. I did this 3 more times, deciding whether or not to see what was in the bag. In the end, I decided to run back to my backyard, and it was a good thing I did because he came back outside seconds later. But he wasn't digging. In fact, he disappeared to the other side of his house and didn't come back. I went back into my house and quietly got back into bed, trying not to wake up my wife. The next day, the first thing I did was look out my window to see that the hole in the ground was completely patched up in Charles' backyard. I also noticed that his SUV was parked in the street now instead of his driveway. I don't know what happened throughout the rest of that night, but I'm disturbed to think that what was at the bottom of that hole might have been his son's body. For all I know, he dug up that hole to remove whatever he had previously buried down there and drive it somewhere else to dump it. This is all speculation, call me crazy if you want. I haven't told anyone, not even my wife. And quite frankly, I don't know what to do. Charles never gave me back my shovel. I'm not going to ask him for it. In fact, he's been avoiding me ever since. And something disturbing happened yesterday. I by coincidence happened to look out my window across to Charlie's house and caught him standing at one of his windows looking into mine. When he saw me, he shut his blinds, and that was in the middle of the day. I have no idea what to do, but I'm honestly terrified. I've lived in 3 houses in my life, 2 with my family and my current house by myself. We lived in the first house for the first 15 years of my life, and the second house the next 7 before I moved out to my current home. This experience happened in my first home when I was 15, within the last few months of my family living in that house. I don't remember my family ever being really friendly with the neighbors. In fact, there were 2 kids living next door with their dad that me and my brother had only talked to maybe once or twice our entire lives, as bizarre as that is, though we did know both of their names, Eric and Todd. One day, me and my brother, who is 5 years younger than me, were outside playing basketball in the driveway. That was when one of the 2 boys next door, Todd, came outside and walked over to us, initiating a conversation. I don't remember what we said to each other quote for quote, but I remember the first thing that he asked us was if it was true that we were moving. As the older brother, I did most, if not all, of the talking. Todd was probably the same age as me. I never actually asked. By the end of the conversation, he invited me to come with he and his brother to shoot BB guns by the river in the woods down the road the next day. I agreed since it was the weekend and I didn't have anything going on anyway. My little brother asked if he could come at the last second, not under the assumption that he was automatically invited as well. Todd said yeah and then walked away. Late the next day, around an hour before dusk, Eric and Todd rang the doorbell. We were quick to answer the door because our parents didn't know that we were going out to shoot BB guns. Walking down the sidewalks with Todd and Eric decked out in camo gear and carrying a duffel bag of BB guns was really strange. The level of seriousness these two clearly had in this was really weird to me and my brother, and we kept meeting eyes, holding in our laughter a couple of times because of it. We got to the woods having spoken very few words. I could already tell these two were kids of few words. Maybe why we hadn't met them officially until that point. Todd dropped the duffel bag onto the ground and unzipped it, while Eric aggressively snapped a branch off a tree and threw it into the river. Me and my brother looked at each other again, this time not finding it as funny. Todd pulled out a couple of guns and handed them to me and my brother, and that's when Todd dropped the bomb and told us they were real guns. Eric grabbed a loaded gun from the bag and began firing at trees across the river. When I realized he wasn't joking about the guns being real, I was in a mix of anger and confusion. I grabbed the gun from my brother's hands and placed both of them back in the bag. I told them we weren't comfortable with this and had to leave. Eric stopped firing, and they both looked at us with expressions that seemed half angry. One of the two boys yelled a curse word at us as we were walking away. I always had a feeling these two were bad kids, but this confirmed it. I told my brother not to speak to them anymore for the remainder of our time living there. We told our parents at the dinner table that night that they were really weird kids, but we didn't mention the gun thing. I woke up that night to a breeze of cold air hitting me in the face. My window was open all the way. I felt something hard press up against the back of my head as I was looking out the window, and somebody behind me going, "Shh, shh." Somehow I didn't scream or jump, I just stayed calm. I was able to understand what was going on surprisingly quickly. I heard Todd's voice in a whisper behind my head. He told me if I ever told anybody, especially his dad, about the guns or the visit, he would come back and kill me and my entire family. I replied in a quiet, shaky voice, "Okay." He pushed my head with his gun before leaving through my window. Every night thereafter for months, I would catch either Todd or Eric at a certain window of their house, looking into either my or my brother's room. Their behavior became more and more strange as we got closer to the date of our move. Just a week before we moved, a rock was thrown at my window one night at like 1 a.m. I opened my window and saw Todd aiming a pistol up at the window, and feeling like I was about to die, I dove for the ground, only to hear the two boys crack up in laughter. I heard one of them refer to me as a fucking retard. There were two other instances that week where the two would harass either me or my brother, and ultimately I couldn't think of a more perfect time for us to have moved and gotten out of there. After all these years, neither me nor my brother told anybody about the boys or their threats. All I know is those two boys were trouble, and it was a good thing we got out of there when we did.
At the time I'm writing this happened 2 weeks ago. I've always hated just about all of my neighbors. I'm fresh out of college and I'm living on my own, but that comes at a price. I'm living in a really shitty area, the only place I could afford a house. So I'm not bound to have the ideal neighbors. The neighbors on one side always have their music blasting, while the neighbors on the other side are the creepiest people I've ever met in my life. It's two people living next door, one woman in her 60s who's not friendly at all and honestly doesn't seem all there, and a slightly younger woman who has some kind of severe mental disabilities. I have no idea what the relationship is between the two. I would commonly be sitting on my front porch when I'd look over next door and see the older woman holding the younger woman back as she'd be having some kind of freak-out episode. She'd have her arms crossed and she'd quickly rock back and forth while screaming and making noises. Sometimes she'd even look over and point at me and mumble stuff to the other woman. It's quite disturbing, actually. Sometimes I even go inside when I get too uncomfortable. Anyway, it was a night like any other. I had to go to bed early for work in the morning. However, the next door neighbors were making an unusual amount of noise.
I could hear the deranged woman screaming and throwing a fit as the older woman yelled in distress. This went on for about an hour, and I couldn't take it anymore. I marched over to the house next door and banged on the door. The older woman answered and greeted me with a "What the hell do you want?" I asked as politely as I could to keep the noise down. In response, she raised her eyebrows and tilted her head down, clearly annoyed by my request. Just then, the younger woman entered the living room, screaming "How dare you!" repeatedly. The older woman held her back from approaching me, and then slammed the door in my face. I had no idea what just happened, but I felt like I didn't accomplish what I came there for. I walked back to my bed in defeat. However, I realized they had finally gone silent next door. I was able to get some sleep at last. Well, I woke up, feeling like the night went way too fast. I looked at my clock and saw that it was only 3 in the morning. My head fell back into the pillow in relief, but pretty soon, I thought I could hear something come from downstairs. I got out of my bed and went over to my door just to make sure I wasn't hearing things. When I didn't hear any other sounds, I went back to bed. I woke up once again to a dark room. Only 20 minutes had passed since I'd fallen back asleep. I didn't know what could have woken me up, though. And then I heard. I panicked and tried to find my phone on my bedside desk as a source of light, but when I found it, I didn't dare turn the light on. I looked around the dark room in silence, trying to find some kind of dark figure in the room. I looked at every corner of the room, and even though it was so dark, I could tell there wasn't anybody standing there. This time I heard where it was coming from. I turned to the edge of my bed and saw a black shadowy circle-like object right at the edge of the wooden wall of my bed. When the light of my phone revealed that black object to be the face of the deranged woman from next door, she screamed like the lunatic she was. She screamed as if she were a vampire in the light. I screamed as well. I screamed as I clumsily ran for the door and tripped halfway, looking back to see the woman following me. I slammed the bedroom door behind me and ran all the way downstairs, where I locked the door leading to the upstairs. I called the cops as the woman pounded on the door, screaming incomprehensible things. When the cops showed up, I told them the woman lives next door and that she was mentally insane. The older woman from next door came over after hearing all the commotion and spoke with the cops, pleading with them to let her go, but they insisted they had to take her in for at least the night. One of the officers asked me if I wanted to press charges, and as he asked this, the older woman gave me the most evil, hateful stare imaginable. I chose not to press charges, but her stare didn't change. The officers drove the ill woman away, while the older woman continued to stare at me as she walked back to her house. 5 minutes later, I saw her get in her car and drive away. These two still live next to me. I'm seriously considering moving out because the creepy woman next door makes it clear she despises me. And I've concluded that the mentally ill woman is not only terrifying, but dangerous as well.